Fluorescent lights in St. Catherine's Hospital buzzed like dying insects, casting sickly yellow pools across linoleum floors that had seen too much suffering and not enough hope. Nora Vale moved through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Shoulders slightly hunched, eyes down, scrubs that had been washed so many times the blue had faded to something closer to gray. At 26, she had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight, of being the hands that changed bedpans and adjusted IV drips without ever being the person anyone actually saw. It was a survival skill she'd developed over years of being overlooked, dismissed, and forgotten. Growing up in foster care had taught her that being noticed usually meant being hurt, so she'd learned to exist in the spaces between other people's attention. Even now, as a nurse aide drowning in debt and exhaustion, she moved through the world like a ghost, present but not present, necessary but never quite real. Nora, room 347 needs fresh linens, and Mr. Peterson in 291 is asking for you again. Sandra, the charge nurse, barely looked up from her computer as she issued orders, her voice carrying the particular irritation of someone who had been working double shifts for too long. "On it," Nora replied automatically, already moving toward the supply closet. Her feet ached in the cheap sneakers she couldn't afford to replace, and her lower back throbbed with the kind of pain that came from lifting patients who weighed twice what she did. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't afford to. The first payment on her grandmother's medical bills was due in 2 weeks. $73,000 for the surgery that might give Margaret Vale another year of life. The number haunted Nora's dreams, a figure so impossibly large it might as well have been $1 billion. She'd already maxed out 2 credit cards, taken a loan from a predatory lender whose interest rate should have been illegal, and picked up every extra shift the hospital would give her. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "Miss Vale?" The voice came from behind her, smooth and professional, with an accent that suggested expensive private schools and summers in the Hamptons. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Nora turned to find a man in a suit that probably cost more than her annual salary standing in the hospital corridor like he owned it. He was in his 50s, silver-haired and impeccably groomed, with the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of people doing exactly what he asked them to do. "I'm working," she said carefully, clutching the stack of linens against her chest like a shield. "If you need help finding someone, the nurse's station." "I'm not looking for medical assistance, Miss Vale. I'm looking for you." He pulled a business card from his pocket with movements so precise they seemed rehearsed. "My name is Vincent Romano. I represent the Moretti family, and I have a proposition that might solve your current financial difficulties." The linen slipped from Nora's hands, scattering across the floor in a cascade of white cotton. She knew the Moretti name. Everyone in the city knew the Moretti name, even if they pretended not to. They were the shadows behind legitimate businesses, the whispers in courtrooms where witnesses suddenly changed their testimony. The reason certain neighborhoods never had problems with street crime, because they had a different kind of problem instead. "I don't know what you're talking about," Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. She knelt to gather the fallen linens, her hands shaking. "I think you have the wrong person. Your grandmother, Margaret Vale, age 74, currently residing at Sunnybrook Assisted Living. She requires immediate surgery for a cardiac condition that will cost approximately $73,000, money you don't have. You've exhausted your credit, taken a loan from Marcus Wheeler at an interest rate of 42%, and you're still short by nearly $60,000. Vincent Romano's voice was gentle, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. "I assure you, Miss Vale, I have exactly the right person." Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. "How do you know all that?" "The Moretti family has extensive resources and a vested interest in finding the right individual for a very particular role." He extended his hand, helping her to her feet with old-world courtesy that felt completely wrong in the shabby hospital corridor. "I understand this must be alarming, but I promise you're not in any danger. Quite the opposite. We'd like to offer you a solution." "I'm not interested in whatever kind of solution the Morettis are offering," Nora said, trying to inject steel into her voice and failing. She sounded exactly like what she was, a terrified young woman who was in way over her head. "Not even a solution that would pay for your grandmother's surgery in full, clear all your existing debts, and provide you with a substantial salary for 6 months of relatively simple work?" Vincent pulled a slim folder from his briefcase. "At least look at the offer before you refuse it. I think you'll find the terms quite generous." Nora knew she should walk away. Every instinct screamed at her to drop the linens, turn around, and run as fast as she could in the opposite direction. The Morettis weren't the kind of people who offered generous terms out of the goodness of their hearts. They were the kind of people who made offers you couldn't refuse, and if you tried to refuse anyway, you usually ended up as a cautionary tale whispered in the dark. But $73,000. Her grandmother's face, pale and drawn with pain, the doctor's grim prognosis. Without surgery, she has maybe 2 months. With surgery, we might buy her another year, possibly 2. What kind of work? Nora heard herself ask, hating how desperate she sounded. Vincent's smile was almost sympathetic. Why don't we discuss this somewhere more private? I have a car waiting. I can have you back at the hospital within an hour. I'm on shift until 7. I've already spoken with your supervisor. She's approved a 2-hour personal break. He gestured toward the exit with practiced ease. Please, Miss Vale, just hear us out. If you decide you're not interested, we'll drive you back to the hospital and you'll never hear from us again. You have my word. The word of a man who worked for the Moretti family was probably worth less than nothing, but Nora found herself following him anyway. She told herself it was just to hear the offer, that she wasn't actually going to accept whatever insane proposal they had in mind. She was just gathering information, that was all. The car waiting outside was exactly what she'd expected. A sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows and a driver who looked like he bench-pressed small cars for fun. Vincent opened the door for her with the same old-fashioned courtesy, and Nora slid into leather seats that probably cost more than everything she owned. They drove through the city in silence, heading away from the hospital's working-class neighborhood and toward the kinds of streets where Nora only went when she was taking the bus through them, never stopping. The buildings got taller, cleaner, more expensive. The people on the sidewalks wore clothes that actually fit, carried bags with designer logos, walked with the confidence of people who had never worried about making rent. The Moretti estate sat behind walls that looked decorative but were probably bulletproof, surrounded by grounds that would have been called a park if they'd been public property. The house itself was a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa that managed to be both beautiful and vaguely threatening, like a lion lounging in the sun, gorgeous until you remembered what it could do to you. This way, please, Vincent said, leading her through a marble foyer that echoed with their footsteps. The interior was all old money and older power, oil paintings in gilt frames, furniture that belonged in museums, the kind of quiet that came from thick walls and thicker secrets. They ended up in a study lined with books that looked like they'd actually been read, unlike the decorative leather-bound sets Nora had seen in magazine spreads about how rich people lived. A fire burned in an enormous fireplace despite the mild weather outside, and sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was a woman who radiated authority the way other people radiated body heat. Isabella Moretti was in her 60s, beautiful in the way that expensive maintenance and good bone structure could preserve, with steel gray hair pulled back in a style that probably had a French name and cost more than Nora's car. She wore all black, elegant, expensive black, and her eyes were the color of espresso and just as bitter. Miss Vale, she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had smoked expensive cigarettes for 40 years and quit recently enough that she still missed them. Thank you for coming. Please, sit. It wasn't really a request. Nora sat in the chair across from the desk, her cheap scrub suddenly feeling even cheaper against the room's obvious wealth. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. I'll be direct, Isabella continued, studying Nora with eyes that seemed to catalog every flaw, every weakness, every desperate edge. My son, Luca, was attacked 3 months ago. The details don't concern you, but the result does. He's paralyzed from the waist down. The doctors say he may regain some function with therapy, or he may not. Either way, his current condition has created a problem. Nora waited, her mouth dry. She had no idea where this was going, but she was certain she wasn't going to like it. In our world, Miss Vale, weakness is death. Luca was meant to take over full control of the family's business operations, but several interested parties have suggested that a man in a wheelchair is not capable of leadership. They're wrong, of course. My son is twice the man any of them will ever be. But perception matters, and right now the perception is that the Moretti family is vulnerable. I still don't understand what this has to do with me, Nora said quietly. Isabella's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. We need to change that perception. Luca needs to appear stable, settled, untouchable. He needs to look like a man who has everything under control, including a personal life that suggests longevity and legacy. He needs a wife. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nora's brain seemed to be moving through molasses, trying to process what she'd just heard, and failing completely. You want me to marry your son? She couldn't quite make the word sound real. Why me? You could find someone, anyone, someone from your world, someone appropriate. We could, Isabella agreed, but those women come with family connections, expectations, agendas of their own. We need someone who will be grateful for the opportunity, someone who understands this is a business arrangement, and someone who won't get ideas above her station when it's time for the arrangement to end. She leaned back in her chair, her expression completely neutral. In 6 months, after Luca has fully consolidated his control, you'll have an amicable divorce. You'll receive a substantial settlement, your debts will be cleared, and you'll be able to start fresh anywhere you choose. And my grandmother's surgery? Paid in full. Tomorrow, if you agree tonight. Nora's hands clenched in her lap. Why would your son agree to this? Doesn't he get a say? Luca understands what needs to be done, Isabella said, her voice cold. He'll do what's necessary for the family. The question is whether you will. Through the study's doorway, Nora could see into what looked like a formal living room. And in that living room, she caught a glimpse of him. Luca Moretti, sitting in a wheelchair with his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension that was visible even from this distance. Someone was talking to him, another man in an expensive suit, and even though Nora couldn't hear the words, she could see the way Luca's hands gripped the wheels of his chair, knuckles white. This was insane. This was absolutely insane. People didn't actually do things like this, didn't sell themselves into arranged marriages with mafia families for money. This was the kind of thing that happened in movies, in books, in cautionary tales about what happened to desperate girls who made bad choices. But $73,000, her grandmother's life, the surgery that could give Margaret Vale another year, maybe 2, of watching birds in the garden at Sunnybrook and telling stories about Nora's mother and remembering what it felt like to live without constant pain. I need time to think about it, Nora said, her voice barely audible. You have 14 days to pay for your grandmother's surgery, Isabella replied. I'll give you until tomorrow evening. If you agree, the money will be transferred and the arrangements will be made. If you don't, we'll find someone else and you'll never hear from us again. She stood, signaling that the meeting was over. Vincent will drive you back to the hospital. Think carefully, Miss Vale. Opportunities like this don't come twice. The drive back was as silent as the drive there. Nora stared out the window, watching the neighborhoods change from wealthy to working class, from clean to cluttered, from dreaming to desperate. When the Mercedes pulled up outside street, Catherine's, Vincent handed her a business card with nothing but a phone number printed on it. Tomorrow evening, he said. Whatever you decide, call that number. Nora took the card with numb fingers. She got out of the car and watched it pull away, disappearing into traffic like it had never been there at all. For a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined the entire thing, if stress and exhaustion had finally broken her brain and sent her into some kind of elaborate hallucination. But the business card was real. The number on it was real. And when she checked her phone and saw 3 missed calls from Sunnybrook Assisted Living, she knew the choice she was facing was real too. Nora, honey, I'm sorry to call you at work. Margaret's voice was thin and tired when Nora called back during her break. I just wanted to hear your voice. The pain's been bad today. I know, Grandma, I know. Nora pressed her forehead against the cold tile of the hospital bathroom, fighting back tears. But the surgery's going to fix it. Just hang on a little longer, okay? I'm going to make sure you get the surgery. Don't you worry about that, sweetheart. If it's my time, it's my time. I've had a good life. You've got to think about your own future now. My future is making sure you're around to see it, Nora said fiercely. I love you, Grandma. I love you too, baby, so much. Nora ended the call and stared at herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her had dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, hair pulled back in a messy bun because she didn't have time for anything else, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from working yourself to death and still falling short. She pulled out Vincent Romano's business card and the crumpled paper with her grandmother's medical bills. $73,000. 6 months of her life. A marriage that wasn't real to a man she'd never met, in a world she didn't understand, surrounded by people who would probably kill her without a second thought if she stepped out of line. But her grandmother would live. The surgery would happen. The debts would be cleared. And in 6 months, she'd be free with enough money to actually start over, to maybe go back to school, to become a real nurse instead of just a nurse aide who nobody noticed. Nora pulled out her phone and dialed the number before she could talk herself out of it. Vincent answered on the first ring. "Miss Vale." "I'll do it," Nora said, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "I'll marry him, but I have conditions." "I'm listening." "My grandmother gets the surgery within 48 hours. All my existing debts are cleared before the wedding, and I want it in writing that after 6 months, I walk away with enough money to go back to school." She closed her eyes, feeling like she was signing her own death warrant. "If you agree to those terms, I'll be at the estate tomorrow at 6 p.m. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Agreed. Mrs. Moretti will have the contracts drawn up. Welcome to the family, Miss Vale." The line went dead. Nora stared at her phone, waiting to feel something: fear, regret, panic, anything. But all she felt was a strange, hollow calm, like she'd just stepped off a cliff and was experiencing that weird moment of peace before the fall. She went back to work. She changed Mr. Peterson's linens, helped Sandra with a difficult patient transfer, restocked the supply closet, and filled out paperwork with hands that had finally stopped shaking. At 7 p.m., she clocked out, took the bus to Sunnybrook, and sat with her grandmother for 2 hours, listening to stories about Nora's mother and pretending everything was normal. "You look tired, sweetheart," Margaret said, patting Nora's hand with fingers that were too thin, too fragile. "You're working too hard." "I'm fine, Grandma. Everything's going to be fine." And maybe, if she said it enough times, she'd start to believe it. The next evening, Nora stood outside the Moretti estate with a small overnight bag containing everything she owned that mattered. Some clothes, her mother's necklace, her nursing textbooks, and a photograph of her and Margaret from 5 years ago when things had been hard but not impossible. Vincent met her at the gate, his expression professionally neutral. "Miss Vale, right on time. The contracts are ready for your review." He led her to a different room this time, a formal dining room with a table that could seat 20 and probably had, for dinners where life and death decisions were made between courses. Isabella Moretti sat at one end, a stack of legal documents in front of her. At the other end sat Luca. This was the first time Nora had seen him clearly, and the impact of it hit her like a physical blow. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair and darker eyes, and a face that would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so cold. He wore a suit that was clearly custom-made, charcoal gray that probably cost more than Nora's car, and he sat in his wheelchair with perfect posture that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. He was looking at her with an expression of such complete disdain that Nora felt herself shrinking, all her careful resolve crumbling under the weight of that stare. "So this is the desperate nurse aide who's selling herself for $73,000, Luca said, his voice low and rough, like he'd spent the last 3 months screaming and had only recently learned how to speak quietly again. "How remarkably convenient for both of us." "Luca," Isabella's voice carried a warning. "What? We're all being honest here, aren't we? She needs money. We need appearances. It's a transaction. Let's not pretend it's anything else." He turned his attention back to Nora, his gaze raking over her cheap clothes and obvious exhaustion. "You understand this is a job, right? You'll live here, attend events as required, play the devoted wife in public, and stay the hell out of my way in private. 6 months. Then you take your money and disappear. Think you can manage that?" Nora's hands clenched at her sides. "I can manage whatever I need to manage." "Good. Because if you can't, if you embarrass this family or cause problems, the consequences won't be pleasant." He smiled, and it was the coldest thing Nora had ever seen. "Do we understand each other, Miss Vale?" "Perfectly, Mr. Moretti." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe that she'd matched his tone instead of collapsing into tears. But it was gone too quickly for Nora to be sure. Vincent cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should review the contracts." The next hour was a blur of legal language that Nora only half understood. She signed where Vincent pointed, initialed clauses about confidentiality and public appearances, and the terms of the eventual dissolution of the marriage. Isabella watched the entire proceeding with those sharp, calculating eyes, while Luca sat in furious silence at the other end of the table, his jaw clenched so tight Nora could see the muscle jumping. "There, Isabella said when the last document was signed. It's done. The wedding will be in 3 weeks. Enough time to make it look legitimate, but not so long that questions are raised about the speed. You'll move into the estate tomorrow. Vincent will help you coordinate with your employer and settle any outstanding matters. My grandmother. The surgery is scheduled for Thursday morning at St. Catherine's, the best cardiac surgeon in the state. She'll have a private room for recovery and round-the-clock care. Isabella's expression softened almost imperceptibly. We keep our promises, Miss Vale. You'll find we're very reliable that way. Nora nodded, not trusting herself to speak. This was real. This was actually happening. In 3 weeks, she was going to marry Luca Moretti, a paralyzed mafia boss who looked at her like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. I'll show you to your room, Vincent said gently, offering his arm like she was an actual guest instead of merchandise they'd purchased for a specific purpose. They left Luca and Isabella in the dining room, and Nora tried not to hear the vicious argument that erupted the moment the door closed behind them. She caught fragments, Luca's furious voice demanding to know why his mother had chosen some nobody, and Isabella's cold response that he should be grateful she was handling the situation at all since he'd proven himself incapable of doing it himself. Vincent led her up a sweeping staircase to the second floor, down a hallway lined with more oil paintings and expensive furniture, to a bedroom that was bigger than Nora's entire apartment. It had its own bathroom, a walk-in closet that echoed when she stepped inside, and windows that overlooked the estate's gardens. Mrs. Moretti has arranged for a stylist to visit tomorrow, Vincent said, setting her small bag on a chair where it looked even more pathetic against the room's grandeur. You'll need appropriate clothing for public appearances. There will also be several meetings to review family protocols and expectations. Family protocols, Nora repeated numbly. How to address certain individuals, which topics are acceptable for discussion, proper behavior at various events. Vincent's expression was kind, almost apologetic. I know this is overwhelming, Miss Vale, but you'll adjust more quickly than you think, and for what it's worth, I believe you have the strength to handle this. After he left, Nora sat on the edge of the enormous bed and stared at her hands. They were still the hands of a nurse aide, rough, reddened, with fingernails kept short for work. Tomorrow she was supposed to transform into someone who belonged in this world, someone who could stand next to Luca Moretti and make people believe she was his choice, not his last resort. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sunnybrook. Margaret is resting comfortably. She's asking about you. Says you sounded strange yesterday. Nora typed back, tell her I love her and I'll visit Thursday after her surgery. Everything is going to be okay. She set the phone down and walked to the window, looking out at gardens that were beautiful in that expensive, carefully maintained way. Somewhere in this sprawling estate, Luca Moretti was probably still furious about being forced to marry a woman he considered beneath him. And Nora was supposed to live here, pretend to love him, smile for cameras, and play the part of a mafia wife for 6 months. She thought about running, just walking out right now, before it was too late, before she was in so deep she couldn't get back out. But then she thought about her grandmother's face, pale with pain, the surgery that could save her life, the debts that were crushing Nora into something smaller and more desperate every day. 6 months, she whispered to her reflection in the window. I can survive anything for 6 months. But looking at her reflection, at the woman who had just sold herself into a fake marriage with the mafia, Nora wasn't entirely sure that was true. She wasn't sure of anything anymore except that she'd just made a deal with people who didn't make mistakes, didn't offer second chances, and definitely didn't care if she survived the next 6 months or not. All she could do now was hope she was stronger than she looked, because in 3 weeks she was going to marry Luca Moretti, walk into a world of violence and power and deadly secrets, and somehow convince everyone that she belonged there. The nurse aide who nobody noticed was about to become the most watched woman in the city, and she had absolutely no idea how to be anyone other than who she'd always been, invisible, desperate, and completely alone. The first morning at the Moretti estate began with a knock so soft Nora almost missed it through the fog of uneasy sleep. She'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling of her palatial bedroom, her mind churning through everything that had happened, everything she'd agreed to, everything that could go catastrophically wrong. When she finally drifted off around 4 a.m., her dreams were full of contract clauses written in blood, and her grandmother's voice calling her name from very far away. Miss Vale? A woman's voice, accented and gentle. May I come in? Nora sat up, disoriented by the unfamiliar room, the silk sheets that felt too smooth against her skin, the morning light filtering through curtains that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. Yes, come in. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She carried a breakfast tray that smelled like fresh coffee and something baked that made Nora's stomach growl embarrassingly loud. I'm Maria, the woman said, setting the tray on the bedside table with practiced ease. I manage the household staff. Mrs. Moretti thought you might prefer breakfast in your room this morning, given that you'll have a very full day ahead. Her smile was warm, genuine, the first truly kind expression Nora had seen since arriving at the estate. How did you sleep? Fine, Nora lied, because admitting she'd barely slept felt like showing weakness, and she had a feeling weakness was the last thing she could afford in this house. Maria's expression suggested she saw right through the lie, but she didn't call Nora on it. Your stylist appointments begin at 10. Mr. Romano will brief you on family protocols at 2, and Mrs. Moretti has requested your presence for dinner at 7. She hesitated, then added more quietly, If you need anything at all, you can find me. I've worked for this family for 20 years. I know how overwhelming it can be. The kindness in her voice made Nora's throat tight. Thank you. After Maria left, Nora ate mechanically, barely tasting the perfectly prepared eggs and fresh pastries. Through the bedroom window, she could see the estate's grounds stretching out in carefully manicured perfection, gardens and fountains and pathways that probably had security cameras hidden in every decorative urn. Somewhere in this sprawling house was Luca Moretti, the man she was supposed to marry in less than 3 weeks. The man who had looked at her last night like she was something contaminating his expensive Persian rugs. The stylist arrived promptly at 10 with an entourage that included 2 assistants, a makeup artist, and enough clothing racks to outfit a small department store. Her name was Domenica, a razor-thin woman in her 50s who wore all black and assessed Nora with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a particularly challenging case. Stand up, Domenica commanded, circling Nora like a shark. Turn around. Slowly. Nora obeyed, feeling her face flush with humiliation as Domenica's critical gaze catalogued every flaw. Her cheap clothes, her bargain bin sneakers, her hair that she cut herself because salon visits were an unaffordable luxury. We have work to do, Domenica announced. Strip down to your undergarments. I need to take measurements. The next 3 hours were a blur of measuring tapes and fabric swatches, of Domenica's assistants holding up designer dresses while their boss made sharp, decisive judgments about what would and wouldn't work. Nora stood like a mannequin, trying not to think about how much each of these outfits probably cost, trying not to calculate how many shifts she'd have to work at the hospital to earn even a fraction of what they were spending on her transformation. You have good bone structure, Domenica said, tilting Nora's chin up to examine her face in the harsh light. Your skin is decent, though clearly you've been neglecting it. We'll fix that. Your hair needs professional attention immediately. I'll send my stylist tomorrow. And these clothes, she gestured dismissively at Nora's worn scrubs and faded jeans. Burn them. You're a Moretti now. You need to look like one. I'm not a Moretti yet, Nora said quietly. Domenica's smile was sharp. Darling, the moment you signed those contracts, you became exactly what they needed you to be. The wedding is just theater. She turned to her assistants. We'll start with the basics: day wear, evening wear, formal events. I want her to have at least 30 complete outfits before the wedding. And get me samples from Valentino and Armani. Mrs. Moretti wants options for the ceremony dress. By the time Domenica and her team finally left, Nora's bedroom looked like a high-end boutique had exploded inside it. Dresses and shoes and handbags, all carefully selected to transform her from invisible nurse aide to credible mafia wife. She stood in the middle of the chaos, feeling more out of place than ever. Vincent arrived at 2 o'clock exactly, carrying a leather portfolio that Nora suspected contained everything she needed to know about becoming someone she wasn't. How are you holding up? He asked, settling into one of the bedroom's absurdly ornate chairs. I feel like I'm in a really expensive nightmare, Nora admitted. His smile was sympathetic. That's actually a fairly accurate description of life in this family, but you'll adapt. He opened the portfolio, pulling out what looked like a family tree. Let's start with the basics. The Moretti family is structured like most traditional organizations. Isabella is the matriarch. She took over after her husband died 8 years ago. Luca is the heir apparent, though obviously his accident has complicated matters. What happened to him? The question came out before Nora could stop it. I mean, if you can tell me. Vincent's expression darkened. He was meeting with representatives from a rival faction. It was supposed to be neutral ground, a discussion about territorial agreements. Someone decided to make a statement instead. 3 men died in that attack. Luca survived, but he gestured vaguely. The damage to his spine was severe. He's been in physical therapy, but progress is slow. And in this world, slow progress looks like weakness. So they decided to marry him off to make him look strong again. They decided to give him a public image that suggested stability and control. You're part of that image, Miss Vale, which means you need to understand exactly how to present yourself. He pulled out another document. These are the family's business associates. Some are legitimate, some are less so. You don't need to know which is which. What you need to know is how to greet them, what topics are safe for discussion, and when to excuse yourself from conversations that don't concern you. The next 2 hours were an intensive crash course in navigating a world Nora had never imagined being part of. She learned which families were allies and which were barely contained enemies. She learned that questions about business were never acceptable, that her role was to be charming and appropriate and completely unthreatening. She learned how to hold a wine glass at formal dinners, how to make polite small talk that revealed nothing, how to smile while powerful men discuss things she absolutely should not hear. "You're a quick study," Vincent said when they finally finished. "That will help." "I'm good at following instructions," Nora replied, thinking of all the times at the hospital when she'd learned complex procedures just by watching once, by paying attention when everyone assumed she wasn't smart enough to understand. "It's one of my few marketable skills. Don't sell yourself short. Isabella wouldn't have chosen you if you were just another pretty face who could follow directions." He closed his portfolio, studying her with those sharp, assessing eyes. "She chose you because you're smart enough to play the role convincingly, but not ambitious enough to want to keep it. That's actually quite rare." Before Nora could respond, Maria appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. "Miss Vale, Mr. Moretti has requested your presence in the East Wing Library." Vincent and Maria exchanged a look that Nora couldn't quite interpret. Then Vincent stood, smoothing his already perfect suit. "I'll leave you to it. Remember what we discussed. Stay calm, stay polite, and don't let him provoke you into saying something you'll regret." That was encouraging. Nora followed Maria through the estate's maze of hallways, trying not to feel like she was being led to an execution. The East Wing was quieter than the rest of the house, the walls lined with more of those expensive paintings and photographs that documented generations of Morettis who had probably all been involved in various criminal enterprises. Maria stopped outside a set of heavy wooden doors. "He's in a mood," she warned quietly. "Don't take it personally. He's been in a mood since the accident." Then, even more quietly, "But don't let him bully you either. Men like him respect strength, even when they pretend not to." Nora knocked, her heart hammering. "Come in." Luca's voice was clipped, irritated. The library was enormous, 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves connected by a spiral staircase that looked like it belonged in a museum. Late afternoon light streamed through tall windows, creating dramatic shadows across Persian rugs and leather furniture that had probably been in the family for generations. And in the middle of it all, positioned in front of a fireplace that wasn't lit, was Luca Moretti in his wheelchair. He was reading a book, or pretending to read a book, because the moment Nora entered, he set it aside with deliberate precision and fixed her with that same cold, assessing stare from last night. "Shut the door," he said. Nora obeyed, feeling trapped, as the heavy door clicked closed behind her. "Sit." He gestured to a chair positioned directly across from him, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair like he was physically restraining himself from saying something he'd regret. Nora sat, folding her hands in her lap and trying to project a calm she absolutely didn't feel. "Let's get something clear," Luca said, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't want you here. I didn't ask for this arrangement, and I certainly didn't ask for some desperate little nurse to play house and pretend we're building something real. My mother decided this was necessary, and arguing with Isabella Moretti is about as productive as arguing with a hurricane. So here we are. Here we are, Nora agreed quietly. You signed a contract. You'll be paid well for playing your part. But I need you to understand the rules, because if you break them, the consequences won't just affect you. He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes boring into hers. Rule 1. What happens in this family stays in this family. You see things, you hear things, you keep your mouth shut. Always. Rule 2. In public, you're the devoted wife. You smile, you defer to me. You make everyone believe we're madly in love. I don't care how good an actress you think you are. You'll be convincing or you'll be gone. Rule 3. In private, you stay out of my way. This is my home. You're a temporary guest. Don't get comfortable. Nora listened to this recitation of rules, feeling something hot and sharp building in her chest. She'd expected coldness from him. Hell, she'd expected contempt. But there was something about the way he was talking to her, like she was a particularly stupid child who needed everything spelled out in small words, that made her suddenly, unexpectedly angry. Are you finished? She asked, her voice steady despite the fury rising in her throat. Luca blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Excuse me? I said, are you finished explaining how this is going to work? Because I have some rules too, if you're done. Nora met his stare without flinching, channeling every ounce of frustrated rage she'd been swallowing for years. Every doctor who'd dismissed her, every patient who'd snapped at her, every creditor who'd called her stupid for getting into debt trying to save someone she loved. Rule 1. I'm not an idiot. I know what I signed up for. I know this is business, and I know exactly how much you don't want me here. You don't need to remind me. Rule 2. If you expect me to play the devoted wife in public, you'll play the devoted husband. That means treating me with basic respect instead of looking at me like I'm something you scraped off your designer shoes. Rule 3. I'll stay out of your way, but this is my home too for the next 6 months. I didn't ask to be here either, but I'm here, and you're going to have to deal with it. The silence that followed was so complete, Nora could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Luca was staring at her like she'd just sprouted a second head, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and something that might have been grudging respect. You've got a mouth on you, he said finally. I've had a lot of practice keeping it shut. But I'm not your employee, Mr. Moretti. I'm your business partner. Temporary, bought and paid for, but still a partner. So if we're going to make this work, you're going to have to stop treating me like I'm beneath you. You are beneath me, Luca said, but there was something different in his voice now, less cold dismissal and more actual engagement. You're a nurse aide from nowhere, marrying into one of the most powerful families in the city because you needed money. Those are just facts. And you're a paralyzed mob boss who needs me to make you look stable and strong because your own reputation isn't enough anymore, Nora shot back. Those are facts too. So maybe we can both acknowledge that we're using each other and move on. For a long, terrible moment, Nora thought she'd gone too far. Luca's expression went absolutely glacial, his entire body going rigid with fury. She could practically see him calculating whether the consequences of getting rid of her would be worth the satisfaction. Then, incredibly, he laughed. It was a short, bitter sound, completely devoid of humor, but it was still a laugh. You know what? Fine. You want to be treated like a partner? Prove you can handle it. He wheeled his chair closer, closing the distance between them until Nora could see the faint scar on his left cheekbone, the shadows under his eyes that suggested he slept about as well as she did. Next week, there's a family dinner, 30 people, all of them watching to see if I've completely lost my mind marrying someone like you. You'll need to convince them that you belong here, that you're not some gold digger who's going to embarrass us all. Think you can manage that? I can manage whatever needs managing, Nora said, echoing his words from last night and watching his eyes narrow at the reminder. We'll see. He wheeled back slightly, putting distance between them again. Domenico will make sure you have appropriate clothes. Vincent will coach you on names and faces. And I will tolerate your presence at this dinner because my mother insists. But understand this. If you make me look weak, if you give anyone in that room ammunition to use against this family, our arrangement ends immediately. Contract or no contract? Understood. Good. Now get out. I have work to do, and you're giving me a headache. Nora stood, her legs shaky with adrenaline. She'd just stood up to Luca Moretti, had talked back to a man who could probably have her killed with a phone call, and somehow she was still alive. It felt surreal, dangerous, like she'd just walked across a frozen lake and only realized after reaching the other side how thin the ice had been. She made it to the door before his voice stopped her. "Miss Vale." She turned back. Luca was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something complicated hiding behind that cold exterior. "That thing you said about basic respect? You're right. I've been taking my anger about this situation out on you, and that's not fair." He shifted in his wheelchair, the movement almost imperceptible, but somehow conveying profound discomfort with what he was saying. "I'll work on it." It wasn't quite an apology, but coming from Luca Moretti, Nora suspected it was close to one. "Thank you," she said quietly, and left before he could take it back. The next week passed in a blur of preparation that felt like boot camp for a war Nora didn't know how to fight. Domenica's stylist transformed her hair from home-cut disaster to sleek, professional elegance. The makeup artist taught her how to create the kind of polished look that appeared natural, but actually required 45 minutes and products Nora had never heard of. She had fittings for the dinner dress, a midnight blue silk that managed to be both modest and devastating, and practiced walking in heels that cost more than her monthly rent used to. Vincent drilled her relentlessly on names and faces, making her memorize the complex web of family relationships and business associations. She learned that Marco Rossi was an ally whose son was married to Isabella's niece, that the Constantino family was currently in a territorial dispute with the Morettis over waterfront properties, that Judge Brennan would be at the dinner and everyone would politely pretend not to know that he'd been on the family payroll for 20 years. "You don't need to remember all of this forever," Vincent assured her during one particularly grueling session. "You just need to get through next week without insulting anyone important or accidentally revealing that you have no idea who half these people are." "That's very encouraging," Nora said dryly. She saw Luca only in passing during those days, glimpses of him being wheeled through hallways by an assistant, once through a window as he did physical therapy in what looked like a private gym. He never sought her out again, and Nora didn't push it. Their conversation in the library had established a fragile truce, and she wasn't eager to test its limits. But 2 days before the dinner, Maria found Nora in the garden, where she'd been trying to calm her nerves by walking the paths and pretending she was anywhere but here. "Mr. Moretti would like you to join him for dinner tonight," Maria said, her expression carefully neutral. "Just the two of you. He thought it might be good to practice before the family event." "Practice," Nora repeated. "His words, not mine." Maria's smile was knowing. 7 o'clock in the small dining room. Domenica left a dress in your room, the green one. The small dining room was still larger than Nora's entire apartment had been, but it was intimate compared to the formal dining room where she'd signed the contracts. The table was set for two, candles providing soft light that made the room feel almost romantic if you ignored the underlying tension crackling in the air. Luca was already there, positioned at the head of the table in his wheelchair, wearing a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and the severity of his features. He looked up when Nora entered, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation that he quickly shut down. "You look," he started, then seemed to think better of whatever he was about to say. "The dress works." "Thank you," Nora said, smoothing the green silk nervously. "I think it was a compliment. I'm not good at those, but I'm trying." He gestured to the chair at the other end of the table. "Sit. Let's see if we can get through a meal without arguing." A young man Nora recognized as one of the household staff appeared with wine, pouring for both of them with practiced efficiency before disappearing again. Luca lifted his glass, studying Nora over the rim. "To 6 months of convincing performances," he said. Nora lifted her own glass. "To getting through them without killing each other." His mouth quirked, not quite a smile, but close. "That's probably a more realistic goal." The first course arrived, some kind of delicate pasta that probably had an Italian name Nora didn't know. She watched Luca from the corner of her eye, trying to match his pace, his movements, the casual elegance with which he navigated a formal meal. "You don't have to mirror everything I do," Luca said, startling her. "Just be yourself. You're supposed to be an ordinary woman who caught my eye, not someone who was trained from birth for this life." "Right. Be myself. That's easy." Nora set down her fork. "Except myself is a nurse aide who lives on ramen and hasn't been on a date in 3 years because I was too busy working double shifts to afford my grandmother's medication. I'm not sure that version of me knows how to navigate a dinner party where half the guests are probably criminals. They're all criminals, Luca corrected. Even the ones with legitimate business fronts. That's the point of this world. Everything is beautiful on the surface and rotten underneath. He took a sip of wine, his expression darkening. And for what it's worth, you're handling this better than most people would. Vincent says you've memorized the entire family tree in less than a week. I'm good at memorization, medical terminology, dosage calculations, patient charts. Names and faces aren't that different. Still impressive. He paused, seeming to struggle with something. My mother told me about your grandmother. The surgery went well? The unexpected kindness in his voice made Nora's throat tight. Yes, she's recovering. I visited her yesterday. She thinks I got a new job working for a wealthy family as a private nurse. She doesn't know about this. Probably for the best. What you told her, I mean. Luca's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She raised you? Since I was 7. My parents died in a car accident, and she was the only family I had left. She was already in her 50s, should have been thinking about retirement, but instead she got stuck raising a traumatized kid with no money and no support. Nora realized she was talking too much, revealing things she hadn't meant to share. Sorry, you didn't ask for my life story. I asked about your grandmother. The rest just follows. Luca set down his wine glass, his dark eyes fixed on her with unexpected intensity. You really would have done anything to save her, wouldn't you? That's why you said yes to this insane arrangement. Wouldn't you? Nora met his gaze. If someone you loved needed you, if you were the only one who could help them, wouldn't you do whatever it took? I don't know, Luca admitted quietly. I've spent most of my life in a world where love is a weakness people exploit, but watching you, listening to you talk about her, maybe I've been wrong about that. The moment stretched between them, fragile and strange. Then the staff arrived with the next course, and the spell broke. They ate in more comfortable silence, the earlier tension easing into something almost companionable. Tell me about the dinner, Nora said as they finished dessert. Some elaborate chocolate creation that was probably worth more than she used to make in a day. What should I expect? Luca's expression hardened again, the brief vulnerability disappearing behind his usual cold mask. 30 people, all of them watching for weakness. They'll smile and congratulate us and ask polite questions while actually trying to figure out if you're legitimate or if this whole thing is a desperate move by a crippled boss trying to save face. Don't call yourself that, Nora said sharply. He raised an eyebrow. What? Crippled. Don't call yourself that. She leaned forward, her voice fierce. You're in a wheelchair. That doesn't make you any less dangerous or less capable of running this empire. Anyone who thinks otherwise is an idiot. Luca stared at her, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face. You don't know anything about this world, about what it means to show weakness. I know what it means to be underestimated, Nora interrupted. I've been invisible my entire life. Do you know how many times doctors talked over me like I wasn't there? How many patients treated me like I was too stupid to understand basic medical concepts because I was just a nurse aide? I know exactly what it's like when people see what they expect to see instead of what's actually in front of them. That's different. It's not that different. They think you're weak now. Prove them wrong. Not by hiding in this house, not by pretending the wheelchair doesn't exist, but by showing them that it doesn't matter. That you're still you, still dangerous, still completely in control. She sat back, suddenly exhausted by her own passion. Sorry, I'm lecturing you about your own life. That's probably not appropriate. No, Luca said slowly. No one talks to me like that anymore. Everyone's too afraid or too polite or too busy feeling sorry for me. His jaw clenched. I hate the pity most of all. Then don't give them any reason to pity you. Walk into that dinner like you own the room, because you do. Let me handle being charming and appropriate. You just be yourself. The version of yourself that scares people into line. For the first time since she'd met him, Luca smiled. Really smiled. Not the cold, bitter expression he usually wore, but something genuine that transformed his entire face. You know what, Miss Vale? I'm starting to think my mother might have actually known what she was doing when she chose you. Call me Nora, she said. If we're going to convince people we're married, you should probably use my first name. Nora, he repeated, testing the name. All right. And you can call me Luca. Not in public. In public, you'll call me darling or my love or whatever sounds natural. But when it's just us, Luca is fine. They finished dinner talking about the logistics of the upcoming event. Who would arrive when, where they should stand, how to gracefully extract themselves from conversations that got too dangerous. By the time Nora returned to her room, it was past midnight, and she was surprised to realize she'd actually enjoyed the evening. Luca was still cold, still arrogant, still utterly convinced of his own superiority. But underneath all that, there was something else, something human and hurting and trying desperately not to show it. She fell asleep thinking about the way he'd smiled, real and unguarded, and wondering if maybe this arrangement wouldn't be quite as terrible as she'd feared. The night of the family dinner arrived with the inevitability of an execution. Nora spent 3 hours getting ready. Hair styled to perfection, makeup applied with surgical precision, the midnight blue dress that made her look like someone who might actually belong in Luca's world. When she finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. "You look beautiful," Maria said from the doorway, her smile warm and maternal. "Truly beautiful. You're going to do wonderfully tonight." "I'm going to throw up," Nora said. "That too, probably. But not on the dress. Domenica would kill me." Maria handed her a small clutch purse. "Everything you need is in there. And remember, you're not just some girl they bought off the street. You're Nora Vale, and you're about to become Nora Moretti. Act like it." Luca was waiting for her at the bottom of the grand staircase, positioned so that when she descended, they would create the exact image his mother wanted, the powerful boss and the beautiful woman who had captured his heart. He looked devastating in a black suit that probably cost more than a car, his dark hair styled back, his expression carefully composed into something almost warm. But when he saw her coming down the stairs, that careful composure cracked. His eyes widened slightly, his lips parting, and for just a moment he looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. "Nora," he said quietly as she reached him. "You look like someone who belongs here," she finished nervously. "Like someone I'd actually choose," Luca said, and the honesty in his voice made her heart skip. "My mother's going to take full credit for this transformation, but the truth is, you were already beautiful. The dress just makes it harder to ignore." Before Nora could respond, before she could process the fact that Luca Moretti had just called her beautiful, Isabella appeared in the doorway to the formal dining room, resplendent in black and dripping with jewelry that probably cost more than a small country's GDP. "Perfect timing," she said, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Nora's appearance and apparently approving. "Our guests are arriving. Remember, you're madly in love. You can barely keep your hands off each other. And Nora, darling, try not to look quite so terrified. You're marrying into power, not walking to your execution." Though right then, as the first guest began to arrive and Nora took her place beside Luca's wheelchair, resting her hand on his shoulder the way they'd practiced, she wasn't entirely sure there was a difference. The formal dining room had been transformed into something out of a film about old money and older secrets. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in cream silk, each place setting featuring china so delicate Nora was terrified to breathe near it. Flower arrangements that probably cost more than her old car created centerpieces that were simultaneously beautiful and vaguely threatening, like everything else in this world. The guests arrived in waves of expensive perfume and calculated smiles. Nora stood beside Luca's wheelchair, her hand resting on his shoulder in what she hoped looked like casual affection rather than desperate need for something to hold on to. She'd memorized the names, studied the faces and photographs, practiced her polite small talk, until the words felt like scripts. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of 30 powerful people all watching her like sharks circling something that might be prey. "Luca, darling," a woman in her 50s glided over, her dress probably costing more than Nora's entire transformation budget. This was Francesca Constantino, wife of the man currently in a territorial dispute with the Morettis. Vincent had warned Nora that Francesca's smiles were inversely proportional to her sincerity. "And this must be your lovely bride-to-be. We've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," Nora said, channeling every ounce of poise she'd learned in the past week. "Of course." Francesca's eyes were cold as they assessed Nora from head to toe. Though I must admit, we were all quite surprised by the announcement. Luca's always been so selective about his companions. Luca's hand came up to cover Nora's where it rested on his shoulder, his fingers warm and strong and surprisingly gentle. When you meet someone who changes everything, selectivity becomes irrelevant, he said smoothly. Nora makes me want to be different, better. The words were part of their agreed-upon script, practiced and polished. But something in the way Luca said them, the slight pressure of his fingers against hers, made Nora wonder if maybe he meant it just a little bit. How romantic, Francesca said, her tone suggesting she found it anything but. And what is it you do, my dear? I heard something about health care. I'm a nurse aide, Nora said, lifting her chin slightly. Vincent had coached her on this. Own it. Don't apologize. Make it part of the story. I was working at St. Catherine's Hospital when Luca and I met. He'd come in for a consultation about his therapy. It was a lie, carefully constructed to explain how someone like her had ended up in Luca Moretti's orbit. They'd agreed the truth that his mother had essentially purchased her like expensive furniture wouldn't play well. How wonderfully modern, Francesca said. A nurse and a Moretti, like something out of a romance novel. More like a fairy tale, Luca interjected, his voice carrying an edge that suggested the conversation was over. If you'll excuse us, Francesca, I need to introduce Nora to the others. They moved through the room like that, Luca's wheelchair cutting through clusters of guests while Nora played her part, smiling, charming, deflecting questions about their relationship with the carefully rehearsed story. She met Marco Rossi, whose handshake was firm and whose eyes were shrewd as he assessed whether she was legitimate or liability. She chatted with Judge Brennan's wife about hospital work, while carefully avoiding anything that might reveal how little power she actually had in the medical hierarchy. She laughed at appropriate moments, touched Luca's shoulder with calculated affection, and tried not to think about how many of these people had probably ordered someone's death between the appetizers and the main course. You're doing beautifully, Luca murmured during a brief moment when they were alone. Better than I expected. Is that supposed to be a compliment? From me? Yes. His hand found hers again, squeezing briefly. Just keep doing what you're doing. We're almost through the worst of it. But he was wrong. The worst was just beginning. Isabella called everyone to dinner with the grace of a woman who had been hosting events like this since before Nora was born. The seating arrangement was strategic, of course. Luca positioned at the head of the table with Nora at his right, Isabella at his left, and everyone else placed according to some complex hierarchy that Nora didn't fully understand but could sense in the way people moved to their assigned seats. The first few courses passed in a blur of polite conversation and excellent food that Nora barely tasted. She was too busy monitoring every word, every gesture, making sure she didn't accidentally reveal that she had no idea what half these people were really talking about when they discussed business interests and territorial considerations. Then, as the main course was being cleared, a man Nora hadn't been properly introduced to yet raised his wine glass. He was in his 40s, handsome in that polished way that suggested extensive grooming and possible cosmetic work, with eyes that reminded Nora of the feral cats that used to prowl around her old apartment building, hungry and calculating and fundamentally dangerous. I'd like to propose a toast, he said, his voice carrying easily across the table. To Luca and his beautiful bride-to-be. May your marriage be everything you both deserve. There was something in the way he said it, some undercurrent that made the hair on the back of Nora's neck stand up. Luca's entire body tensed beside her, his hand clenching around his wine glass hard enough that Nora worried it might shatter. Thank you, Antonio, Isabella said coolly. Your well wishes are appreciated. Antonio Salvatore. Nora remembered now. Vincent had mentioned him briefly, called him ambitious and dangerous, said he'd been positioning himself as a potential alternative to Luca's leadership since the accident. And from the way he was looking at them now, smiling like he knew a secret no one else did, Nora realized this toast was actually a declaration of war. Of course, we're all curious, Antonio continued, ignoring Isabella's dismissal. It's such an unusual match. A nurse and a Moretti. I'm sure you can understand why some of us wonder about the timing of this announcement. The timing of two people falling in love is rarely convenient, Luca said, his voice dangerously calm. Or are you suggesting something else, Antonio? Not at all. I'm merely observing that it's fortunate Miss Vale came into your life precisely when you needed to demonstrate stability. Antonio's smile widened. One might almost think it was orchestrated. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Nora could feel everyone watching, waiting to see how Luca would respond, whether this would escalate into something more than verbal sparring. Antonio. Marco Rossi's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Perhaps we should save business discussions for after the ladies have retired. This isn't business, Marco. This is simply concern for our friend Luca. Antonio turned his attention fully to Nora now, his eyes stripping away the expensive dress and careful makeup to see the desperate girl underneath. Tell me, Miss Vale, what does your family think about this sudden engagement? They must be thrilled. I don't have much family, Nora said quietly, feeling Luca's hand find hers under the table, squeezing in what might have been support or warning. Just my grandmother, and she's happy that I'm happy. How convenient. No complicated family connections to navigate. No one to ask difficult questions. Antonio leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, like he was discussing the weather instead of essentially calling Nora a fraud in front of 30 witnesses. You'll forgive my directness, but in our world, marriages are alliances. They're about power and legacy and strengthening family bonds. What exactly do you bring to this union besides a pretty face and convenient timing? The silence that followed was absolute. Nora could feel her face flushing, humiliation and fury warring in her chest. She wanted to stand up, to throw her wine in Antonio's smug face, to tell him exactly what she thought of him and his world, and the casual cruelty with which he'd just tried to destroy her in front of everyone. But before she could do any of those things, Luca moved. He didn't stand, couldn't stand, not yet. But he pushed back slightly from the table, his entire bearing shifting into something that made even Antonio's smile falter. When Luca spoke, his voice was soft and cold and more threatening than any shout could have been. What Nora brings to this union is none of your concern, Antonio. But since you've decided to make it your business, let me be perfectly clear about something. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. For 3 months, I've been sitting in this chair listening to people like you whisper about weakness and succession and whether I'm still capable of leading this family. I've been patient because my mother asked me to be, because tradition demands a certain amount of political theater, but my patience has limits. Luca's hand was still holding Nora's under the table, his grip almost painful now. Nora isn't a political alliance. She isn't a strategic move. She's the woman I'm choosing to marry because she sees me as something other than a damaged piece on a chessboard. And if you or anyone else in this room has a problem with that, you're welcome to say so directly instead of hiding behind concern and polite questions. Luca, Isabella started, but he cut her off. No, Mother. Antonio wanted to have this conversation in front of everyone, so let's have it. Luca's eyes never left Antonio's face. You think I'm weak now. You think the wheelchair makes me less dangerous, less capable of maintaining control. You're wrong. And if you push me, if you continue to question my decisions or undermine my authority, you'll discover exactly how wrong you are. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Antonio's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized he'd miscalculated badly. Challenging Luca's choice of bride was one thing. Forcing Luca to publicly assert his authority was something else entirely. I meant no disrespect, Antonio said finally, his voice lacking its earlier swagger. You were simply testing boundaries, Luca interrupted. Consider them tested and clearly established. He turned to Isabella, his expression softening slightly. I apologize for the disruption, Mother. Perhaps we should move to the parlor for coffee. Isabella's smile was sharp and approving. An excellent suggestion. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced normalcy. People moved to the parlor, conversations resumed with careful politeness, and Antonio disappeared early, claiming a previous engagement that no one believed. But the damage was done. Everyone in that room now knew 2 things. Luca Moretti was not nearly as weakened as they'd hoped, and Nora Vale was under his protection in a way that made her untouchable. It wasn't until after midnight, after the last guest had left and Isabella had retired to her rooms, with a final approving nod in Nora's direction, that Luca finally allowed himself to show the toll the evening had taken. His hands were shaking slightly as he wheeled himself toward the library, and Nora followed without being asked. "You should go to bed," Luca said once they were alone, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You did well tonight. Better than well. You were perfect." "So were you." Nora closed the library doors, giving them privacy. "That thing with Antonio, that was incredible. Terrifying, but incredible. That was necessary." Luca poured himself a whiskey with hands that were steadier now, the trembling under control. "He was testing me, seeing if I'd let him disrespect you publicly. If I had, every other ambitious lieutenant would have seen it as permission to question my judgment. So defending me was really about defending yourself." Luca looked at her sharply. "It was about defending us. This arrangement only works if people believe it's real, Nora. Tonight, I made it real for them. Whether it's actually real or not doesn't matter. The perception is what counts." But something in the way he said it, the way he'd held her hand through dinner, the way he'd called her the woman he was choosing, made Nora wonder if the line between performance and reality was blurring for him the same way it was blurring for her. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "You can ask. I may not answer." "Earlier, when you said I see you as something other than a damaged piece on a chessboard, did you mean that? Or was that just part of the script?" Luca was quiet for a long moment, staring into his whiskey like it held answers. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "A month ago, before all this, I would have said yes. It was just script, performance, the kind of thing people in our position say to sell a story." He looked up at her, his dark eyes unguarded in the dim library light. "But you do see me differently than everyone else does. You argue with me. You call me out when I'm being an ass. You told me not to call myself crippled like my disability was something I was doing wrong. Because it's not," Nora said fiercely. "I know that intellectually, but knowing it and believing it are different things." He set down his glass, his expression complicated. "Everyone else treats me like I'm fragile now. Even my mother, who's never been fragile a day in her life. They speak more softly around me, move more carefully, ask permission before doing things they used to just do. But you don't. You treat me like I'm still the same dangerous bastard I was before the accident." "Because you are," Nora said. "The wheelchair didn't change who you are, Luca. It just changed how you move through the world." He laughed, short and bitter. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. Other people make it complicated because it makes them uncomfortable." She moved closer, settling into the chair across from him. "I spent years being invisible in hospitals, watching how people treat nurses versus doctors, how they dismiss the aides like we're not even there. I know what it's like when people see what they expect to see instead of what's real. So maybe I'm better at seeing past the wheelchair because I'm used to people not seeing past my scrubs." "Maybe," Luca agreed. Then, quieter. "Thank you for tonight, for playing your part so well, for not falling apart when Antonio came at you. I wanted to throw my wine in his face. I know, I could see it in your eyes." His smile was genuine now, warm. "I would have paid a lot of money to watch you do it." "Your mother would have killed me." "Probably, but it would have been worth it." He wheeled closer, close enough that Nora could see the faint scar on his cheekbone, the exhaustion shadowing his eyes. "The wedding is in 2 weeks. After tonight, after what I said in front of everyone, we can't back out now even if we wanted to. Are you sure you can handle this? 6 months of being Nora Moretti, of playing this role, of living in a world where people like Antonio exist." "Are you sure you can handle being married to someone like me?" Nora countered. "Someone who argues with you and doesn't know the difference between a salad fork and a regular fork and comes from absolutely nowhere." "I'm starting to think I prefer it," Luca said softly. "At least with you, I know exactly where I stand. There's no hidden agenda, no family politics, no maneuvering for position. You're just honest. It's refreshing. I'm also terrified, exhausted, and completely out of my depth. That too. But you hide it well." He reached out, his fingers brushing her hand in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "We're going to be okay, Nora. Both of us. This arrangement, it might actually work." Nora wanted to believe him. Standing there in the quiet library with the dinner party chaos finally behind them, with Luca looking at her like she was something more than just a convenient solution to his problems. She wanted desperately to believe that this insane arrangement might somehow turn into something bearable. She just wasn't sure if bearable was enough anymore. Because somewhere between the contract signing and tonight's dinner, somewhere in the space between performance and reality, Nora had started wanting more than she'd bargained for. The next 2 weeks passed in a frenzy of wedding preparations that made the earlier transformation process look simple by comparison. There were flowers to choose, though Nora had no opinion about whether roses or orchids better suited a mafia wedding. There were invitations to approve, though she didn't know any of the 300 people being invited. There was a dress, multiple dresses actually, because apparently changing outfits during the reception was expected, and more fittings with Domenica, who had strong opinions about everything. "You're getting married into one of the most powerful families in the city," Domenica reminded Nora during a particularly exhausting fitting. "Every woman there will be looking for flaws, for signs that you don't belong. The dress needs to be perfect. You need to be perfect." "No pressure," Nora muttered, standing still while Domenica's assistants adjusted the train of a dress that probably cost more than Nora's old annual salary. Through it all, Luca was present but distant, handling his own preparations and the increasingly complex business of consolidating his control over the family operations. Nora saw him at dinner most nights, their practice sessions having evolved into something almost companionable. They talked about the wedding logistics, about the guests who were coming, about how to handle the ceremony itself. "I can't stand at the altar," Luca said one night, his voice flat. "The doctors say I'm making progress, but not enough. Not yet." "So we'll adapt the ceremony," Nora said. "There's no rule that says you have to stand, Luca. We'll make it work. Everyone will see it as weakness. Everyone will see a man who's confident enough in his power that he doesn't need to perform for them." She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "Let them think whatever they want. You know who you are. That's what matters." But she could see the frustration in his eyes, the anger at his own body for not healing fast enough, for not being what he needed it to be. And she understood, because she'd spent her whole life fighting against limitations she couldn't control, against a world that told her she wasn't enough. 3 days before the wedding, Nora visited her grandmother at Sunnybrook. Margaret was recovering well from the surgery, looking healthier than she had in months, her color improved and her breathing easier. But her eyes were sharp as she studied Nora in the visiting room, taking in the expensive clothes and professional styling. "Tell me the truth," Margaret said, patting the seat beside her. "This job you took, it's not just about being a private nurse, is it?" Nora's heart sank. "Grandma." "I'm old, sweetheart, not stupid. You show up here wearing clothes that cost more than our rent used to. You've lost weight from stress, and you've got that look in your eyes like you're carrying the world on your shoulders." Margaret took Nora's hands, her grip surprisingly strong. "What did you do?" For a moment, Nora considered lying, maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. But looking into her grandmother's eyes, seeing the woman who had raised her and sacrificed everything for her, she couldn't do it. "I made a deal," Nora said quietly. "A good deal, one that saved your life and gave us both a chance at a better future. But it's complicated, and I can't tell you all the details. I just need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. Are you in danger?" "No, I'm protected, very protected, actually." Nora managed a smile. "I'm getting married, Grandma. That's part of the deal. To someone powerful, someone who can provide the kind of security we've never had." Margaret's expression shifted from worry to something more complex. "You're marrying someone you don't love for money." "I'm marrying someone I barely know for a lot of complicated reasons, only some of which are about money," Nora corrected. "But he's not a bad man, Grandma. He's just difficult. And this arrangement works for both of us." "And in 6 months, when your contract is up?" Margaret's eyes were too knowing. "What happens then?" Nora's throat tightened. "How did you—" "I raised you, baby. I know when you're making sacrifices for me." Margaret pulled Nora into a hug that smelled like antiseptic and the lavender lotion she'd used Nora's whole life. "I love you for it. I hate it, but I love you for it. Just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't lose yourself in this deal. Whatever world you've stepped into, whatever role you're playing, don't forget who Nora Vale really is. Don't let them change the parts of you that matter." Nora held her grandmother tight, fighting back tears. "I promise." But driving back to the estate later that evening, Nora wasn't sure she could keep that promise. because the truth was, she was already changing. The woman who had walked into the Moretti estate 3 weeks ago, desperate, invisible, certain this was just a transaction, wasn't the same woman who was about to marry Luca Moretti. That woman had started to care, had started to look forward to their dinners together, to the rare moments when Luca let his guard down and smiled at her like she was the only real thing in his carefully constructed world. That woman was in danger of wanting this arrangement to be more than it was. And wanting things in Luca Moretti's world was the fastest way to get hurt. The night before the wedding, Isabella summoned Nora to her private sitting room. It was the first time Nora had been in this part of the estate, a suite of rooms that managed to be both luxurious and strangely austere, decorated in blacks and grays with touches of deep red that looked almost like dried blood in the lamplight. "Sit," Isabella commanded, and Nora obeyed, settling onto a chair that was probably an antique and definitely uncomfortable. Isabella poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to Nora before settling into her own chair with the grace of a queen granting audience. "Tomorrow, you become a Moretti. I want to make sure you understand what that means." "I understand," Nora said carefully. Vincent explained the practical aspects. "I'm talking about something deeper." Isabella's dark eyes were piercing. "This family has survived for 4 generations because we understand that love is a luxury and loyalty is a necessity. We make hard choices. We protect our own. We do what needs to be done, regardless of personal cost." "I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to tell me." "I'm telling you that in 6 months, when this arrangement ends, you will walk away with your money and your freedom and you will never speak of this family again." "That was the agreement." Isabella leaned forward slightly. "But I'm also telling you that if you hurt my son, if you betray his trust or embarrass this family, or use the position you've been given for personal gain beyond what was agreed upon, there will be consequences. Do you understand?" The threat was clear, delivered with the kind of casual certainty that made it all the more terrifying. Nora nodded, her mouth dry. "Good." Isabella sat back, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Now, there's something else you should know. Luca was engaged before, about 4 years ago. Her name was Valentina Rossi, Marco's daughter. It was a strategic match, meant to strengthen the alliance between our families." Nora's stomach dropped. "What happened?" "Luca called it off 3 months before the wedding. He said he couldn't marry someone he didn't respect, someone who saw him only as a means to power." Isabella's smile was cold. Valentina was furious. She married someone else quickly, trying to save face, but she never forgave Luca for the humiliation. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Valentina will be at the wedding tomorrow, and she will be watching very carefully to see if you're real or if you're just another strategic arrangement Luca was forced into." Isabella took a sip of her wine. If she suspects this marriage is a business transaction, she will use that information. She still has connections in this world, still has influence, and she would very much like to see Luca fail. The weight of this new information settled over Nora like a shroud. One more person to convince, one more performance to nail perfectly, one more way this could all go catastrophically wrong. "I can handle it," Nora said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I hope so, because tomorrow the entire city will be watching. And if you fail, if anyone suspects this marriage is anything other than a love match, the consequences won't just affect you. They'll affect Luca, they'll affect this family's standing, and they'll affect every plan we've made to consolidate power." Isabella stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Get some sleep, Nora. Tomorrow is going to be the most important performance of your life." Nora made it back to her room before the shaking started. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling, her breath coming in short gasps that felt like the beginning of a panic attack. This was too much. Too many people watching, too many ways to fail, too much riding on her ability to convince 300 guests that she was madly in love with a man she barely knew. A knock at the door made her jump. "Come in," she called, trying to steady her voice. Luca wheeled himself into the room, and Nora realized this was the first time he'd ever come to her bedroom. He looked tired, shadows under his eyes suggesting he'd slept about as well as she had lately. "My mother told me about her conversation with you," he said without preamble, "about Valentina. She wanted to make sure I knew what I was walking into tomorrow. She wanted to terrify you into being perfect." Luca moved closer, his expression frustrated. "I'm sorry. I should have told you about Valentina myself. I just didn't think—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "I didn't think she'd matter. But of course she matters. Everything matters when you're trying to convince people you're something you're not." "Are we, though?" The question came out before Nora could stop it. "Convincing people we're something we're not?" Luca looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" Nora stood, pacing to the window because she couldn't sit still anymore. "I mean that somewhere in the last 3 weeks, this stopped feeling like just a performance to me. I look forward to our dinners. I worry about you when you push yourself too hard in therapy. I get angry on your behalf when people underestimate you. And I don't know if that's just me getting too invested in the role or if it's something else." The silence that followed was so complete Nora could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She'd said too much, revealed too much, broken the cardinal rule of their arrangement by admitting she was developing actual feelings. "Nora," Luca's voice was rough. "Look at me." She turned, and the expression on his face took her breath away. It wasn't the cold dismissal she'd expected, wasn't the irritation at her for complicating their simple business arrangement. It was something raw and honest and completely unguarded. "I don't know what this is either," he admitted. "I've been telling myself it's just proximity, just the natural result of spending time together and playing these roles. But the truth is, I think about you when you're not around. I find myself wanting to tell you things I've never told anyone. And when Antonio came at you at that dinner, the fury I felt wasn't about protecting the arrangement. It was about protecting you." Nora's hands were shaking again, but for a different reason now. "So what do we do?" "I don't know. This arrangement has an expiration date. In 6 months, you're supposed to walk away with your money and start fresh somewhere else. That was the deal. And it was a good deal for both of us." Luca wheeled closer, close enough that Nora could see the conflict in his eyes. "But I'm starting to think 6 months isn't going to be enough. And I'm starting to think that's a problem." "Why is it a problem?" "Because I don't do relationships, Nora. I don't do vulnerability and feelings and all the things that make people weak in this world. I've spent my entire adult life being the person this family needed me to be. Cold, calculating, untouchable. And then you walked in wearing cheap scrubs and an attitude, and you made me want to be different." His jaw clenched. "You made me want things I can't afford to want." Nora knelt in front of his wheelchair, bringing them eye to eye. "What if I want those things too?" "Then we're both in trouble," Luca said roughly. "Because this world doesn't reward people who fall in love. It punishes them. It uses their feelings against them. And I won't let that happen to you. Shouldn't I get to decide what risks I'm willing to take? Not when those risks could get you killed." His hands cupped her face, his touch gentle despite the fierce intensity in his eyes. "Tomorrow, we get married. We put on the performance of our lives. We convince everyone that we're madly in love. And then we have 6 months to figure out if what we're feeling is real, or if it's just the pressure of this arrangement making us confuse proximity with something deeper." "And if it is real," Nora whispered, "then we deal with it when the time comes. But for now, for tomorrow, we focus on getting through the wedding without anyone suspecting this started as anything other than a love match." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "Can you do that? Can you walk down that aisle tomorrow and marry me in front of 300 people and make them all believe you chose this?" "Yes," Nora said, and realized she meant it. "I can do that." Because the truth was, she was choosing this. Maybe not the way she'd originally agreed to, not as a simple transaction to save her grandmother's life, but she was choosing Luca Moretti, complicated, damaged, dangerous. Luca Moretti, who looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world of beautiful lies. She was choosing him, and tomorrow she was going to marry him. And whether that was the smartest decision or the most catastrophic mistake of her life remained to be seen. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, winter sunlight streaming through Nora's bedroom windows like a spotlight illuminating the stage where she was about to give the performance of her life. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying Luca's words over and over, the feeling of his hands on her face, the admission that he was starting to want things he couldn't afford to want. Somewhere around 4 a.m., she'd given up on sleep entirely and watched the sun rise over the estate's gardens, trying to convince herself that marrying into a mafia family was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Maria arrived at 6 with coffee and a smile that suggested she knew exactly how little Nora had slept. "Big day," she said gently, setting down a tray with pastries Nora's nervous stomach couldn't possibly handle. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified, exhausted, like I might throw up." Nora managed a weak smile. "So, completely normal for a bride, right?" "Completely normal," Maria agreed, though her eyes were kind. "Domenica and her team will be here at 8 to start getting you ready. Mrs. Moretti wants you in the ceremony dress by 11. The wedding starts at noon." 5 hours to transform herself into someone who could stand beside Luca Moretti and make 300 people believe she belonged there. Nora had faced impossible odds before, but this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, with no idea if there was water or rocks waiting at the bottom. Domenica arrived with her usual entourage and immediately took over Nora's bedroom like a general commanding troops. The next 3 hours were a blur of hairstyling and makeup application and the kind of fussing over details that would have driven Nora insane if she'd had the energy to protest. The dress, when they finally lowered it over her head with the reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts, was a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate lace that managed to be both traditional and somehow perfectly modern. "Perfect," Domenica pronounced, stepping back to assess her work. "You look like you were born to wear that dress. Born to be a Moretti." Nora stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. The expensive styling, the flawless makeup, the dress that probably cost more than everything she'd owned in her previous life. It all combined to create someone who looked powerful and elegant and completely in control. Someone who could absolutely be marrying Luca Moretti because she'd chosen to, not because she'd been desperate enough to sell herself for her grandmother's medical bills. "Can I have a moment alone?" Nora asked quietly. Domenica studied her for a long second, then nodded. 5 minutes. Then we need to get you downstairs." She herded her assistants out, leaving Nora alone with her reflection and her rapidly spiraling thoughts. Her phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother. "I love you, sweetheart. I wish I could be there, but I'm thinking of you every moment. Be happy." Nora's throat tightened. Margaret thought this was real, thought Nora was marrying someone she loved. The lie sat heavy in Nora's chest, making it hard to breathe. But what could she say? That she'd sold 6 months of her life to save Margaret's? That the man waiting for her downstairs was essentially a business arrangement with complications? Another text came through, this one from a number she didn't recognize. "Good luck today. You're going to be magnificent. Luca." The fact that he'd texted her, that he'd taken the time to reach out when he must be dealing with his own pre-wedding chaos, made something warm bloom in Nora's chest. Maybe this started as a transaction. Maybe it was still technically a transaction. But somewhere in the space between contracts and performance, something real had started growing. She just hoped it was strong enough to survive what came next. The ceremony was being held in the estate's garden, transformed overnight into something out of a fairy tale with thousands of white roses, towering floral arrangements, and chairs arranged in perfect rows for the 300 guests who represented the city's most powerful families. As Nora made her way downstairs with Maria and Domenica flanking her like bodyguards, she could hear the string quartet playing and the murmur of voices as guests arrived. Vincent was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, impeccable as always in a charcoal suit. His expression when he saw Nora was one of genuine warmth. "You look beautiful, Miss Vale. Truly beautiful." "Thank you," Nora managed, her voice shaky. How is Luca?" "Focused, ready, probably about as nervous as you are, though he'd never admit it." Vincent offered his arm. "He asked me to tell you that he'll be waiting at the altar and that you should remember to breathe." The walk through the estate felt surreal, like Nora was floating outside her own body, watching herself move through rooms filled with flowers and candles, and evidence of the obscene amount of money that had been spent to make this fake wedding look real. Through the windows, she could see the garden ceremony space, could see the guests already seated, could see the arch of white roses where Luca would be waiting. Isabella intercepted them in the hallway leading to the garden, resplendent in black Armani with diamonds at her throat that could probably fund a small country. She studied Nora with those sharp, assessing eyes, taking in every detail of the dress, the styling, the way Nora was barely holding herself together. "You'll do," Isabella said finally, which coming from her was practically effusive praise. Remember what we discussed. You're madly in love. You can barely believe your luck. You're marrying the man of your dreams." "I remember," Nora said quietly. "Good." Isabella's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "And Nora? Despite how this arrangement began, I want you to know that Luca is fortunate to have you. You've handled these past weeks with more grace than I expected, more grace than many women born to this life could manage." Before Nora could respond to that unexpected compliment, Isabella swept away, leaving Nora alone with Vincent and the sound of the string quartet shifting into a new piece, the processional music signaling it was time. "Ready?" Vincent asked gently. Nora wanted to say no, wanted to run back upstairs, climb out a window, disappear into the city, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But she thought about her grandmother recovering in her hospital room, thought about the debts that had been crushing her for years and were now cleared, thought about Luca's hands on her face last night, and the raw honesty in his voice when he'd admitted he was starting to want things he couldn't afford to want. "Ready," she lied, and let Vincent lead her toward the garden. The walk down the aisle felt like it took both seconds and hours. Nora was aware of faces turning toward her, of whispered conversations falling silent, of hundreds of eyes assessing whether she was worthy of the man waiting at the altar. She kept her gaze forward, her hand steady on Vincent's arm, her breathing controlled even though her heart was racing fast enough to make her dizzy. And then she saw Luca, and everything else fell away. He was positioned at the altar in his wheelchair, but he'd been right about one thing. He didn't look weak. He looked powerful and dangerous, and absolutely in command despite the fact that he couldn't stand. He wore a black suit that had been custom-made to perfection, his dark hair styled back, his expression carefully composed into something that might have been joy if you didn't know him well enough to see the tension underneath. But when his eyes met Nora's, something in his face changed. The careful composition cracked, revealing something raw and real and entirely unguarded. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at shore, like she was the only thing keeping him anchored in a world that had tried to break him. Nora reached the altar, and Vincent stepped back, leaving her standing alone in front of Luca. The officiant, some judge that Isabella had probably appointed herself, began speaking about love and commitment and the sanctity of marriage. But Nora barely heard the words. She was too focused on Luca, on the way his hands were gripping the arms of his wheelchair, on the muscle jumping in his jaw like he was physically restraining himself from saying something he'd regret. "You're beautiful," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "You're not supposed to see me until now," Nora whispered back. "Bad luck." "I don't believe in luck. I believe in taking what I want and holding on to it." His eyes never left her face. "And right now, what I want is to get through this ceremony without everyone seeing that I'm completely out of my depth." "Join the club," Nora said, and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile. The ceremony proceeded with the kind of formal gravity that 300 witnesses demanded. There were readings about love that felt both ironic and painfully appropriate. There were vows that Nora and Luca recited in steady voices that only shook slightly. And then came the moment Nora had been both dreading and anticipating, the exchange of rings and the pronouncement that would make this arrangement legal in the eyes of both the state and the criminal underworld that watched their every move. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge intoned. "You may kiss the bride." For a moment, nothing happened. Luca sat frozen in his wheelchair, his dark eyes locked on Nora's face, and she could see him calculating, deciding, choosing in real time whether to give the audience what they expected or to push back against the performance one final time. Then he reached for her, his hand curling around the back of her neck, pulling her down to him with a gentleness that belied the strength in his grip. And he kissed her. It wasn't the chaste, appropriate kiss Nora had expected. It was deep and claiming and absolutely real, the kind of kiss that made her forget where they were, forget the 300 people watching, forget that this had started as a business arrangement. His other hand came up to cup her face, holding her to him like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. When they finally broke apart, Nora was breathless and dizzy and completely certain that whatever was happening between them had crossed some invisible line from performance into reality. The reception was being held in the estate's grand ballroom, which had been transformed into something out of a film about old money and new power. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over tables draped in white silk, each centerpiece a towering arrangement of white roses and orchids that probably cost more than Nora used to make in a month. A live band played sophisticated jazz that provided background for the kind of conversations where fortunes and futures were decided between courses. Nora and Luca sat at the head table, Isabella on Luca's other side, fielding congratulations from an endless stream of guests who approached to pay their respects. Nora smiled until her face hurt, accepted kisses on both cheeks from people whose names she'd memorized, but whose loyalties she couldn't begin to guess, and tried not to think about how many of these well-wishers would probably be just as happy to see the marriage fail spectacularly. "You're doing wonderfully," Luca murmured during a brief lull in the receiving line. His hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. "Just a few more hours, and the worst of it will be over." "Then what?" Nora asked quietly. "Then we go upstairs to the suite that's been prepared for us, and we either consummate this marriage or we don't, depending on what you want." His thumb stroked across her knuckles. "No pressure either way. This is your choice, Nora. It's always been your choice." Before she could respond, a woman approached their table, mid-30s, stunning in a red dress that probably violated several laws of physics, with the kind of calculated beauty that came from expensive procedures and extensive maintenance. Her smile was sharp as broken glass. "Luca," she purred, leaning in to kiss his cheek with familiar ease. "Congratulations. I'm so happy for you." This was Valentina Rossi. Had to be. The possessive way she touched Luca's shoulder, the way her eyes raked over Nora with barely concealed disdain. It all screamed of a woman who had expected to be the one in Nora's seat and was furious about the substitution. "Valentina," Luca said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming. This is my wife, Nora." "Yes, the nurse." Valentina's smile didn't reach her eyes. How wonderfully romantic, like something out of a movie, the powerful man brought low by tragedy, saved by the selfless healthcare worker. Very touching. "I prefer to think I saved myself," Luca said coolly. "Nora just gave me a reason to try." "How sweet." Valentina's gaze shifted to Nora, assessing and finding wanting. "You must be overwhelmed, dear. All of this—" She gestured at the opulent ballroom, the expensive guests, the obvious wealth, "is so different from your world. I do hope you'll be able to adjust. This life isn't easy, you know. It requires a certain breeding." Nora felt Luca's hand tighten on hers, felt his entire body go rigid with controlled fury. But before he could respond, before he could defend her the way he had at the family dinner, Nora spoke. "You're right," she said pleasantly, meeting Valentina's eyes without flinching. "This world is different from what I'm used to. Where I come from, people actually work for what they have instead of inheriting it. They value substance over appearance. And they definitely don't pretend to be happy for someone when they're actually bitter about being replaced." The silence that followed was absolute. Valentina's face flushed with anger, her carefully composed expression cracking to reveal the rage underneath. Luca made a sound that might have been a choked laugh. "I see Luca has found someone who matches his own lack of refinement," Valentina said acidly. "How appropriate." I think what you mean is that he found someone who won't let herself be walked over by petty, jealous women who can't accept that they weren't good enough," Nora replied, her voice sweet as poison. "But thank you so much for the well wishes. They mean absolutely nothing to us." Valentina's eyes narrowed to slits. For a moment, Nora thought she might actually escalate the confrontation into something physical. Then Isabella's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Valentina, darling, your father is looking for you. Something about a business matter that requires immediate attention." Isabella's smile was all teeth. "You should probably run along." Valentina left with as much dignity as she could muster, but the damage was done. The nearby guests had witnessed the entire exchange, and Nora could already see the whispers spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. The new Mrs. Moretti had just publicly eviscerated Luca's former fiancé, and the criminal underworld loved nothing more than a good scandal. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen," Luca said once Valentina was out of earshot. "I'm honestly not sure which." "She was trying to make me feel small," Nora said, her hand shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "I'm so tired of people trying to make me feel small." "Well, you certainly didn't look small." Luca brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles in a gesture that was both intimate and public. You looked magnificent. Terrifying, but magnificent. Isabella leaned over, her expression amused. Valentina will make trouble for this. You realize that, don't you? Let her try, Luca said, his voice hard. I'm done pretending to care about the feelings of people who want to see me fail. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of food Nora barely tasted, champagne toast that made her uncomfortable, and their first dance as husband and wife. Luca had worried about this moment, about how it would look for him to dance from his wheelchair. But when the time came and Nora stood in front of him while he guided her through a slow waltz with his hands on her waist, it didn't matter that he wasn't standing. What mattered was the way he looked at her, the way they moved together, the way 300 people watched and believed they were seeing something real. Because maybe, Nora thought as Luca pulled her closer, they were. It was past midnight when the last guests finally left, and Nora found herself being escorted by Maria to the suite that had been prepared for the newlyweds. It was in the East Wing, separate from both Nora's old room and Luca's, a neutral space that was somehow meant to be theirs together. The bedroom was enormous, dominated by a bed that could sleep 4 people comfortably, with windows overlooking the gardens and a sitting area with a fireplace that was already lit. Mr. Moretti said he'd be up shortly, Maria said gently. He's just finishing some business with his mother. Can I get you anything? Help you out of the dress? No, thank you. I can manage. Nora managed a smile. Thank you, Maria, for everything. You've been so kind to me. You're family now, Maria said simply. That's what we do for family. She left, closing the door softly behind her. Nora stood alone in the suite, still wearing the wedding dress, still processing everything that had happened. The ceremony, the kiss, the confrontation with Valentina, the dance. It all felt surreal, like she'd lived through someone else's life for the past 12 hours. She was struggling with the dress's intricate fastenings when the door opened and Luca wheeled himself in. He'd removed his jacket and tie, unbuttoned the top buttons of his shirt, and he looked exhausted in a way that made Nora want to wrap her arms around him and tell him everything would be okay. Hey, he said softly, closing the door. Hell of a day. Hell of a day, Nora agreed. How are you doing? Tired? Sore? My back is killing me from sitting in that chair for 8 hours straight. He wheeled closer, his eyes traveling over her in the wedding dress. You need help with that. Please, there are about 40 buttons, and I can't reach half of them. Luca positioned his wheelchair behind her, his fingers finding the tiny buttons at the back of the dress. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as he worked his way down the row of fastenings. That thing you said to Valentina about people trying to make you feel small, you meant that, didn't you? I've been invisible my whole life, Nora said quietly, feeling the dress loosen as he worked. Being a nurse aide, being in foster care before that, being the girl nobody noticed or remembered. And then I come here. And suddenly everyone's watching me, judging me, waiting for me to fail. Valentina was just one more person trying to put me back in that box of being nobody special. You're not nobody special. Luca's hand stilled on her back. You're the woman who argued with me in my own library, who told me to stop calling myself crippled, who stood up to Antonio Salvatore at a family dinner and made him look like an amateur. You're the woman who just became my wife, which means you're under my protection, and anyone who tries to make you feel small is going to answer to me. Nora turned to face him, the dress gaping open in the back, but still covering everything important. Is this real, Luca? What's happening between us? Is it real, or are we just really good at pretending? I don't know, he admitted, his dark eyes searching her face. I've been trying to figure that out for weeks. All I know is that when I saw you coming down that aisle today, when I kissed you at the altar, it didn't feel like pretending. It felt like the most honest thing I've done in years. So what do we do now? Now we take this one day at a time. We're married. That's real, whether it started as a business arrangement or not. And we have 6 months to figure out if we want it to stay real beyond the contract. He reached up, cupping her face with one hand. But tonight, right now, I just want to know if you're okay. If you're comfortable staying here with me, or if you'd rather go back to your old room. Nora thought about that. About the choice he was giving her, the way he was making this her decision, instead of assuming she'd just comply with whatever he wanted. It It was such a small thing, but it mattered. It mattered more than she could put into words. "I'll stay," she said, "if you want me to." "I want you to," Luca said roughly. "I've wanted you to for longer than I should probably admit." He helped her out of the dress, hanging it carefully in the enormous closet, while Nora changed into the silk nightgown that had been laid out on the bed. It was beautiful and expensive and made her feel simultaneously elegant and vulnerable. When she emerged from the bathroom, Luca had moved to the bed, transferring himself from the wheelchair with practiced efficiency. "Come here," he said, holding out his hand. Nora climbed into bed beside him, and Luca pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her like she was something precious that needed protecting. They lay like that in the firelight, not talking, just existing together in the quiet aftermath of a day that had changed everything. "Thank you," Luca said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "For today, for standing beside me, for handling Valentina, for making everyone believe we're something real, for making me believe we might actually be something real." "We are something real," Nora whispered against his chest. "I don't know what yet, but it's real, Luca. I'm sure of that." He kissed the top of her head, and they fell asleep like that, tangled together, still figuring out the boundaries of whatever they were becoming, but certain of one thing. The contract that had brought them together was starting to mean a lot less than what they'd discovered in the space between obligation and actual choice. The next 3 months passed in a strange limbo between performance and reality. Publicly, they were the perfect couple. Nora appearing at Luca's side at business dinners and charity galas, playing the devoted wife, while he reclaimed control of the family's operations with a ruthlessness that reminded everyone why he'd been chosen as heir in the first place. His progress in physical therapy was slow but steady, and there were rumors circulating that he might walk again, might stand, might prove everyone who'd written him off completely wrong. Privately, things were more complicated. They shared the suite in the East Wing, shared meals and conversations, and increasingly intimate moments that blurred the line between contract and commitment. Nora finished the online courses she'd started for her nursing degree, supported by resources she'd never had access to before. Luca pushed himself relentlessly in therapy, driven by a need to prove something Nora wasn't sure he actually needed to prove. But there were good moments too. Mornings when they'd have coffee together and Luca would tell her stories about growing up in this world, about learning to navigate the politics and violence from the time he could walk. Evenings when Nora would read to him from the books in his library, her voice soothing the tension that never quite left his shoulders. Nights when they'd fall asleep wrapped around each other, and Nora would wonder how she'd ever thought this could stay simple. They didn't talk about what would happen when the 6 months ended. Didn't discuss whether the arrangement would continue or whether Nora would take her money and leave as planned. It was like they'd both silently agreed that acknowledging the expiration date would make it real, would force them to make decisions they weren't ready to make. And then, 3.5 months into their marriage, everything changed. They were attending a charity gala, one of those high society events where wealthy people paid obscene amounts of money to feel good about themselves while actually just networking and making deals. Luca had been in a good mood earlier, joking with Nora as they got dressed, stealing kisses that had made them late. The gala was being held at one of the city's most exclusive hotels, the ballroom filled with the kind of people who moved money and power like chess pieces. Nora wore a silver dress that Domenica had proclaimed devastating, and Luca looked sharp in a tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding presence. They were standing near the bar, talking with Marco Rossi about some business development on the waterfront, when Luca went suddenly still. His hand tightened on Nora's waist, his entire body tensing in a way that made her immediately alert. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," Luca said, but his eyes were fixed on something across the room. I need to stand up." Nora's heart stopped. "Luca, I can do it. I've been practicing with the therapist. I can stand for maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute if I'm careful." His jaw clenched. "And I need to do it now, in front of everyone, because if I don't, if I stay in this chair, they're going to keep seeing me as weak." "You're not weak. I know that. You know that. But they need to see it." He looked at her, his eyes fierce and determined and a little bit desperate. "Help me, please." Nora wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he didn't need to prove anything to these people. But she understood the drive underneath the request, understood that this was about more than just standing. This was about reclaiming something that had been taken from him, about showing the world that Lucas Moretti was still dangerous, still powerful, still completely in control. "Okay," she said quietly. "Tell me what you need." Luca positioned his wheelchair carefully, his hands gripping the arms. "Just stay close. If I start to fall, I need you to catch me without making it obvious." "I've got you," Nora promised. And then, with movements that were slow and deliberate and clearly cost him enormous physical effort, Luca Moretti stood up. The conversations around them faltered, then stopped completely. 300 people watched as the man they'd written off as permanently disabled rose from his wheelchair with Nora standing protectively at his side. He wavered slightly, his legs shaking with the effort, his hands reaching for Nora to steady himself. But he was standing. He was standing at a charity gala in front of the entire criminal underworld, and the message was unmistakable. Lucas Moretti was far from finished. "Dance with me," he said to Nora, his voice rough with pain and triumph and something that might have been love. "Luca, you can't." "I can. I have maybe 45 seconds before my legs give out, and I want to spend them dancing with my wife." His arms came around her waist, pulling her close. "Dance with me, Nora. Let them see that I chose you, that this is real, that nothing, not the attack, not the wheelchair, not any of their doubts, can touch what we have." So Nora danced with him. They swayed together in the middle of the ballroom, barely moving, Luca leaning heavily on her for support while trying to make it look casual. And in that moment, with his arms around her and 300 witnesses watching, Nora realized something terrifying and wonderful. She was in love with him. Completely, irrevocably in love with Luca Moretti, and the 6-month expiration date on their contract didn't change that at all. They made it through exactly 42 seconds of dancing before Luca's legs began to give out. Nora felt it in the way his weight shifted, the tremor that ran through his body, the desperate tightening of his grip on her waist. She eased him back toward the wheelchair with movements so smooth that anyone watching might think they'd simply decided to stop dancing, might not realize that Luca Moretti had just pushed his broken body to its absolute limit for the sake of pride and perception. "I've got you," she murmured against his ear as she helped him sit, her hand steadying him while he tried to control the shaking in his legs. "You did it, Luca. Everyone saw." "Everyone saw," he repeated, his voice tight with pain and satisfaction. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the ballroom's perfect climate control, and Nora could see the effort it took for him to keep his expression neutral, to not let anyone see how much that 42 seconds had cost him. The applause started slowly, just a few people at first, then building until the entire ballroom was clapping. Not polite charity gala applause, but something genuine and surprised and maybe a little bit awed. Luca Moretti had stood. He'd danced with his wife. He'd shown them all that the wheelchair was temporary, that his power was permanent, that anyone who'd thought they could take advantage of his weakness had better recalculate. Marco Rossi approached their table, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with reassessment. "That was quite a demonstration, Luca." "Just dancing with my wife," Luca said coolly, though Nora could feel the tremor still running through his body where her hand rested on his shoulder. "Nothing particularly dramatic about that." "Of course not." Marco's smile was thin. "Though I imagine certain parties will find it very interesting. There's been talk, you know. Speculation about succession, about whether Isabella might need to consider alternative arrangements for family leadership. I suspect the talk will be considerably quieter after tonight." "One can hope," Luca said, and there was steel underneath the polite words. "Or certain parties can continue speculating, and I can continue demonstrating why that's a mistake." After Marco left, after they'd fielded another hour of congratulations and thinly veiled attempts to determine exactly how mobile Luca actually was, they finally made it back to the car. The moment the door closed behind them, Luca's careful control shattered. His hands were shaking violently, his face pale with pain, and Nora could see him fighting to stay conscious. "Don't talk," she said firmly, shifting into the nurse mode that came naturally after years in hospitals. "Just breathe. We'll get you home, get you medication, get you into bed. You pushed too hard, Luca. Way too hard." "Had to," he managed through gritted teeth. "Had to show them." "I know, and you did. But right now, you need to let me take care of you." The drive back to the estate felt endless. Nora held Luca's hand the entire time, monitoring his breathing, watching for signs that the pain was becoming unmanageable. By the time they pulled through the gates, he was barely holding on, his body rigid with the effort of not screaming. Maria was waiting for them, her face creased with worry. "I called Dr. Morrison. He's on his way." Between Nora and Vincent, they got Luca upstairs to the suite, onto the bed where he could finally stop pretending to be in control. His physical therapist arrived within minutes, followed by Dr. Morrison, and for the next 2 hours Nora watched as they assessed the damage Luca had done to muscles and nerves that were still healing, still fragile, definitely not ready for the kind of stress he'd just put them through. "You could have set your recovery back months," Dr. Morrison said bluntly, preparing an injection of something that would help with the pain. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking that I needed to stand," Luca ground out, "and I did, so worth it." "Your wife doesn't think it was worth it," the doctor replied, nodding toward Nora, who was standing by the window with her arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming down her face that she was trying desperately to hide. "Look at her, Luca. Look at what watching you hurt yourself is doing to her." Luca's eyes found Nora's, and something in his expression cracked. "Nora, don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Just don't. I know why you did it. I understand the politics, the perception, all of it. But watching you push yourself like that, watching you in that much pain just to prove a point to people who don't deserve proof." She turned away, swiping angrily at her tears. "I can't watch you destroy yourself, Luca. I can't." The doctor and therapist exchanged glances, then quietly excused themselves, leaving Luca and Nora alone in the suite. The medication was starting to work, easing the worst of the pain, but Luca still looked like he'd been through a war. "Come here," he said quietly. "Please." Nora moved to the bed, sitting carefully on the edge so she didn't jostle him. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his face, the cost of constantly having to prove himself in a world that equated physical strength with power. "I'm sorry," Luca said, reaching for her hand. "You're right. I pushed too hard. But Nora, you have to understand, in my world, the moment they see weakness, the moment they think you can't protect what's yours, everything falls apart. I needed them to see that I'm still strong, that the wheelchair is temporary, that betting against me is a losing proposition." "I understand that," Nora said, squeezing his hand. "But I also need you to understand something. I don't care if you ever stand again. I don't care if you're in that wheelchair for the rest of your life. It doesn't make you less dangerous, less capable, or less worthy of running this empire. And if you keep sacrificing your health, your recovery, your future for the sake of people who will never truly respect you anyway, you're going to destroy yourself, and I can't stand by and watch that happen." "Why not?" The question was raw, vulnerable. "Why do you care so much? This was supposed to be a business arrangement, Nora. 6 months, then you walk away with your money and start fresh. So why does it matter to you if I destroy myself?" "Because I love you, you idiot," Nora said, the words bursting out before she could stop them. "I'm in love with you, and I have been for months, and watching you hurt yourself kills me. So no, I can't just be your contract wife who looks the other way while you prove points to people who don't matter. I can't do that anymore." The silence that followed was absolute. Luca stared at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language, his dark eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. "You love me," he repeated slowly, like he was testing the words. "Yes, I love you. I'm sorry if that's not part of the contract, if it complicates the arrangement, but I can't help it. I've tried not to. I've tried to keep this professional, but I failed spectacularly." Nora tried to pull her hand away, suddenly desperate to escape, but Luca held on tight. "Don't apologize," he'd said roughly. "Don't ever apologize for that. Because I love you too, Nora. I've been in love with you since you told me to stop calling myself crippled, maybe even before that. I've just been too afraid to admit it, because love in my world is dangerous. It's a weapon people use against you, and I couldn't stand the thought of you becoming a target because of my feelings." "I'm already a target," Nora pointed out. "The moment I married you, I became a target. So we might as well love each other while we're at it." Luca laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his abused muscles. "Come here," he said again, tugging her down beside him on the bed. "Lie with me, just for a while." Nora curled up next to him, careful of his injuries, and Luca wrapped his arms around her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. They lay there in this quiet suite, both of them processing the admissions they'd just made, the fact that their contract marriage had become something neither of them had planned for. "What do we do now?" Nora asked finally. "We have 2.5 months left on the contract. Do we just pretend we didn't just confess we're in love with each other?" "Hell no," Luca said firmly. "We acknowledge it. We figure out what it means, and we decide together whether 6 months is where this ends, or if we want to try something real beyond the contract." "I want real," Nora whispered. "I want you, Luca. Not the arrangement, not the money, not any of it. Just you." "You have me," he promised. "You've had me for longer than I want to admit. We just need to figure out how to make this work in a world that doesn't exactly encourage happy endings." But before they could figure anything out, before they could even begin to navigate what came next, Valentina Rossi made her move. It started with a phone call 3 days after the gala. Nora was in the library, working on an assignment for her nursing course, when Vincent appeared in the doorway with an expression that made her stomach drop. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Valentina has been talking to reporters. She's claiming that your marriage to Luca is a fraud, that you were hired to play the role of his wife to make him look stable, and that the entire thing is a business arrangement designed to deceive the family's associates." The blood drained from Nora's face. "She can't prove that." "She has evidence, or she claims to have evidence. Emails between Isabella and various investigators researching your background. Financial records showing the money that was paid for your grandmother's surgery. Documentation of the original contract terms." Vincent's expression was grim. "I don't know how she got access to that information, but if she releases it publicly, if she goes to the press with proof that this marriage is a sham, the fallout will be catastrophic." Nora's hands were shaking. "Does Luca know?" "He knows. He's with Isabella now, trying to figure out damage control. But Nora, you need to understand, if this information becomes public, it won't just embarrass the family. It will give Luca's enemies the ammunition they need to argue that he's unfit for leadership, that he's so weak he had to buy a wife to create the illusion of stability." "What do I need to do?" Vincent hesitated. "Isabella thinks the cleanest solution would be for you to leave. Take a payout, disappear, let Luca claim the marriage was a mistake and move on. If you're not here, if you're not part of the picture, it's harder for Valentina to prove anything." "Absolutely not," Nora said immediately. "I'm not leaving Luca to deal with this alone. Even if staying makes everything worse?" "Especially if staying makes everything worse." Nora stood, her jaw set with determination. "Where are they? I need to talk to Luca." She found him in Isabella's study, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the 3 days since the gala. He was hunched in his wheelchair, his expression haunted, while Isabella paced like a caged predator considering her options. "Nora," Luca said when he saw her, "you shouldn't be here. This is family business." "I am family," Nora interrupted. "I'm your wife. Maybe it started as a contract, but it's real now, and I'm not walking away just because your ex-fiancé wants revenge. If you stay, if this information becomes public, you'll be destroyed too," Luca said roughly. "Everyone will know you married me for money, that you sold yourself to save your grandmother. They'll crucify you, Nora, and I won't let that happen. So what's your alternative? Send me away and pretend none of this meant anything? Let Valentina win?" Nora moved closer, kneeling in front of his wheelchair so they were eye to eye. "I love you, Luca. And yes, this marriage started as a transaction. Yes, I was desperate, and you needed appearances. But what we have now is real, and I'm not going to let Valentina take that away from us." Isabella stopped pacing, studying Nora with those sharp, calculating eyes. "You realize what you're saying. If you stay, if we fight this together, there's no going back. You'll be permanently tied to this family, permanently part of our world. The contract's expiration date becomes irrelevant." "Good," Nora said firmly, "because I don't want an expiration date anymore. I want a real marriage with the man I love, and I don't care who knows how it started." Luca's eyes were suspiciously bright. "You're sure? Because once we do this, once we commit to making this real, there's no protection for you. You'll be a Moretti in every sense, with all the danger that entails." "I'm sure," Nora said, taking his hands. "I've never been more sure of anything." Isabella's smile was sharp and approving. "Then we stop playing defense and go on the offense. Valentina wants to expose the contract?" Fine. We expose it ourselves, but we control the narrative. We admit the marriage had unconventional beginnings, but we emphasize that it became something real. We make it a love story instead of a scandal. Will that work? Nora asked. In our world? Possibly. People respect honesty more than they respect perfection. If we own the story, if we present it as two people who found each other under unusual circumstances, it's harder for Valentina to weaponize it. Isabella turned to Luca. But you need to make a choice, son. Are you ready to commit to this publicly? To tell the world that yes, the marriage started as strategy, but Nora became the real thing? Luca looked at Nora, his expression raw with emotion. I'm ready. I've been ready since she told me to stop calling myself crippled and started treating me like I was still dangerous. Then we do this together, Isabella said. We call a family meeting, we tell them the truth before Valentina can, and we make it clear that anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with me. The family meeting was held that evening in the estate's formal dining room, the same room where Nora had first been assessed and found wanting by Luca himself all those months ago. 30 people, the inner circle of the Moretti organization, gathered to hear what Isabella described as an important announcement regarding Luca's marriage. Nora stood beside Luca's wheelchair, her hand on his shoulder, as Isabella addressed the room with the authority of someone who had been making life and death decisions for decades. There have been rumors, Isabella began, her voice carrying easily across the silent room. Speculation about the nature of Luca's marriage to Nora. Questions about timing, about motivation, about whether this union was strategic or genuine. I'm here tonight to address those questions directly. She paused, letting the tension build. Nora could feel every eye in the room on her, could sense the speculation and judgment and curiosity crackling in the air. The truth is that Luca's marriage to Nora began as a business arrangement, Isabella continued, and the room erupted in shocked murmurs. Nora needed resources to save her grandmother's life. We needed to demonstrate stability and continuity of leadership during a difficult transition period. A contract was drawn up, terms were agreed upon, and a 6-month arrangement was established. Nora felt Luca's hand cover hers on his shoulder, squeezing in support. However, Isabella said, her voice cutting through the noise, what began as strategy became something neither of them anticipated. They fell in love, genuinely, undeniably in love. And that love has transformed what could have been a simple business transaction into a real marriage. How convenient, a voice called from the back. Antonio Salvatore, of course, his tone dripping with skepticism. The contract wife claims to love the boss just as the arrangement is about to be exposed. The arrangement was exposed by Valentina Rossi, who has been attempting to gather evidence to embarrass this family and undermine Luca's authority, Isabella said coldly. We're getting ahead of her narrative by telling you the truth ourselves. And if you doubt the sincerity of Luca and Nora's feelings for each other, you're welcome to leave now. The door is behind you. Nobody moved. Luca stood up, slowly, carefully, using Nora for support but standing nonetheless, and the room fell into absolute silence. For 3 months after the attack that put me in this chair, I thought my life was over, Luca said, his voice steady, despite the obvious pain standing was causing him. I thought the wheelchair meant I was finished as a leader, finished as a man, finished as anything other than a cautionary tale. And then Nora walked into my life. He looked down at her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way Nora had never seen him show anyone else. She saw past the wheelchair, past the anger, past all the walls I'd built to protect myself. She argued with me when everyone else was too afraid or too polite. She challenged me to be better, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to prove something to myself. And yes, she was paid to marry me. Yes, there was a contract, but what we have now has nothing to do with contracts or money or strategy. It has everything to do with the fact that I'm in love with my wife, and I plan to stay married to her long after the original 6 months are up. The silence that followed was profound. Then Marco Rossi started clapping, slow, deliberate applause that was quickly picked up by others in the room. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to matter. If anyone has a problem with my son's marriage, you can discuss it with me personally, Isabella said, her voice carrying an edge that suggested that discussion would not be pleasant. Otherwise, this matter is closed. Luca and Nora are married. They will remain married. And anyone who attempts to use the circumstances of their union against them We'll discover exactly how unwise that decision was. The meeting dissolved into cautious conversation, people approaching to offer congratulations that ranged from genuine to clearly forced. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that they'd controlled the narrative, had taken Valentina's weapon and diffused it by being honest before she could be exposing. Luca made it through exactly 10 minutes of standing before his legs gave out. Nora helped him back into the wheelchair, ignoring the whispers, focusing only on getting him somewhere private where he could stop pretending to be fine. They ended up back in their suite, Luca in obvious pain but also strangely peaceful. "We did it," he said, letting Nora help him onto the bed. "We actually did it." "We told the truth," Nora corrected, "which is apparently a radical concept in your world." "Our world," Luca said, pulling her down beside him. "It's our world now, Nora. For better or worse, you're stuck with the Morettis." "I can think of worse fates," she said, kissing him softly. "Like being stuck with Valentina." That night, wrapped in Luca's arms, Nora felt something she hadn't felt in months: peace. The contract that had brought them together didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the choice they'd made together. The commitment to building something real in a world built on lies and power and carefully maintained appearances. Valentina tried to release her evidence to the press anyway, but Isabella's contacts made sure those stories never saw print. A week later, Valentina's husband was arrested on unrelated fraud charges, and Valentina herself retreated to their summer house in the Hamptons, her influence in the city effectively neutralized. Nora never asked what Isabella had done to make that happen. Some questions were better left unanswered. The remaining 2 months of the original contract period passed in a blur of normalcy that felt surreal after everything they'd been through. Luca continued his physical therapy, making slow but steady progress. He could stand for longer periods now, could walk short distances with support, and his doctors were cautiously optimistic about continued improvement. Nora finished her nursing degree, passing her certification exam with scores that qualified her to work anywhere she wanted. But when she received job offers from prestigious hospitals across the city, she turned them down. Instead, she started working with a foundation that Isabella helped her establish, providing healthcare resources to underserved communities, the kind of communities where Nora had grown up, where people like her grandmother struggled to afford basic care. Margaret recovered fully from her surgery and moved into a smaller apartment near Sunnybrook, where she could be close to her friends but have her own space. She never asked detailed questions about Nora's marriage, but she watched her granddaughter with knowing eyes and seemed satisfied that whatever complicated arrangement Nora had made, it had turned into something worth keeping. 6 months and 1 week after their wedding, Nora woke to find Luca already awake beside her, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, stretching. "The contract expired a week ago," Luca said quietly. "You could leave now, take your money, start fresh somewhere else. That was the deal." "Are you asking me to leave?" "I'm asking if you want to stay." Nora sat up, looking at the man who had started as her employer, had become her husband in a ceremony designed for appearances, and had somehow transformed into the person she loved most in the world. He was still dangerous, still complicated, still carrying the weight of an empire built on morally questionable foundations. But he was also the man who had stood for 42 seconds at a gala just to prove a point, who pushed himself relentlessly in therapy while refusing to let anyone see how much it hurt, who had chosen honesty over appearances when it came to their relationship. "I want to stay," Nora said, "not because of the money, not because I'm afraid of what happens if I leave, but because I choose you, Luca. I choose this life, this world, this marriage. Every day I choose you." "Then I have something for you." Luca reached into the drawer of his bedside table and pulled out a small velvet box. "I know I already gave you a ring, a big flashy ring designed to signal to everyone that you belong to me, but this is different." He opened the box to reveal a simple band, white gold, elegant, with a single diamond so small it was almost modest by Moretti standards. "I want to propose to you properly," Luca said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because I need a wife for appearances, not because my mother orchestrated an arrangement, but because I love you, and I want to spend my life with you. Nora Vale Moretti, will you marry me? Really marry me, not as a contract, but as a choice?" Nora was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes, Yes, of course. Yes. Luca slipped the simple band onto her finger beside the flashy engagement ring from their first wedding. And somehow the contrast, the expensive symbol of their contractual beginning next to the modest symbol of their real commitment, felt perfect. We should renew our vows, Nora said, wiping at her tears. Do the ceremony again, but this time make it about us instead of appearances. My mother is going to insist on another massive event, Luca warned. Then we'll do 2 ceremonies. One massive event to satisfy your mother and the family politics, and one private ceremony, just us and the people who actually matter, where we say vows that mean something. They ended up doing exactly that. 3 months later, there was another grand wedding at the estate, 300 guests, flowers that cost a fortune, all the political theater that came with being a Moretti. But a week after that, in the garden where they'd first gotten married, Luca and Nora stood together in front of just a handful of people, Maria, Vincent, Margaret, and Isabella, and spoke vows they'd written themselves. I promise to see you, Nora said, her hand in Luca's as afternoon light filtered through the trees. Not the wheelchair, not the power, not the Moretti name, but you. The man who argues with me over breakfast, who pushes himself too hard and refuses to admit when he's in pain, who chose honesty when lying would have been easier. I promise to challenge you, support you, and love you exactly as you are. I promise to let you, Luca replied, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. To stop pretending I don't need anyone. To stop measuring my worth by whether I can stand or walk or meet some arbitrary definition of strength. I promise to trust you with the parts of myself I've spent my whole life hiding, to build a life with you that's about more than just power and perception. And I promise to love you, Nora, not as the woman who saved my reputation, but as the woman who saved me. They kissed as husband and wife for the second time, and this time there were no witnesses to convince, no performance to maintain. Just 2 people who had found each other in the middle of a transaction and had chosen to build something real. A year after that second ceremony, Luca walked into the foundation's new clinic, walked without support after months of brutal physical therapy that had finally paid off, and found Nora treating a young mother who couldn't afford her daughter's asthma medication. He watched as his wife, the former nurse aide who had been invisible in hospital corridors, commanded respect and attention while making sure that mother left with everything she needed at no cost. You're staring, Nora said later, finding him in her office. I'm admiring, Luca corrected, pulling her into his arms. My wife, the healthcare revolutionary who bullies pharmaceutical companies into donating medication and somehow makes them thank her for it. I learned from the best, Nora said, kissing him. I married a man who runs a criminal empire by making everyone think they're choosing to follow him, when really he's just that terrifying. Former criminal empire, Luca corrected. We're almost entirely legitimate now, remember? Your influence. Our influence, Nora said. We did this together. And they had. Over the past year, Luca had been systematically transforming the Moretti family's operations, divesting from anything overtly criminal, investing in legitimate businesses, using the power and connections they'd built over generations for something other than profit and intimidation. It was slow work, dangerous work, and there were still elements in the organization who resisted. But with Nora beside him, with someone who saw the possibility of being better rather than just being powerful, Luca was building something he'd never thought possible, a legacy he could actually be proud of. The foundation grew, expanding to serve 3 more neighborhoods. Nora hired people from those communities, nurses and social workers who understood what it meant to struggle, who wouldn't judge the patients who came through their doors. And Luca used his connections and resources to make sure those clinics stayed funded, stayed protected, stayed exactly what they needed to be. Margaret lived to see her great-granddaughter born 2 years later, a tiny, perfect girl that Nora and Luca named Sophie, after Nora's mother. Margaret held the baby in the hospital room, tears streaming down her face, and told Nora she'd done good, that whatever complicated path had led here, it had been worth it. You saved me, Margaret said, kissing Sophie's forehead. And now you're saving all those other people who need someone to fight for them. I'm so proud of you, baby. Margaret passed away peacefully 6 months later, surrounded by family, in the apartment Luca had made sure she could afford. Her funeral was small but heartfelt, attended by friends from Sunnybrook and neighbors who had known her for years. And Luca stood beside Nora through all of it, supporting her while she grieved, understanding that loss in a way only someone who had lost people themselves could truly understand. She was proud of you, Luca said later, holding Nora while she cried. She told me once that I'd better take care of you or she'd haunt me. I think she meant it. She definitely meant it, Nora said, managing a watery laugh. She was tiny but fierce. Like her granddaughter, Luca said, kissing the top of her head. Who argues with mob bosses and pharmaceutical executives with equal enthusiasm? Life settled into a rhythm that felt both surreal and perfectly natural. Luca continued to lead the family, now with a reputation for being ruthless in business, but unexpectedly philanthropic when it came to community investment. Nora ran her foundation, expanding services and fighting battles with insurance companies and government bureaucracies that somehow felt more challenging than dealing with the criminal underworld. Isabella, in a move that surprised everyone, gradually stepped back from daily operations, claiming she wanted to spend her remaining years doing something other than managing family politics. She traveled, invested in art galleries, and occasionally appeared at the foundation to terrorize pharmaceutical representatives into better donation terms. Your mother just made a grown man cry, Nora reported one afternoon, finding Luca in his office. He's from Preston Pharmaceuticals, and she convinced him to donate a year's supply of insulin at cost. That's actually generous for her, Luca said, pulling Nora onto his lap. Last month, she made someone donate 2 years' supply and throw in a cash contribution. I love your mother, Nora said. She's terrifying, but I love her. She loves you too. She told me last week that marrying you was the smartest thing I've ever done, and given that she orchestrated the whole thing, I'm pretty sure she was complimenting herself. They celebrated their 5th anniversary, counting from the first wedding, not the second, with a quiet dinner at home, Sophie asleep upstairs while they sat in the library where they'd had their first real conversation. So much had changed since that night when Nora had told Luca to stop calling himself crippled, when they'd both been pretending this arrangement could stay simple. Do you ever regret it? Luca asked, swirling wine in his glass. Signing that contract, walking into this world, everything that came after? Nora thought about it, really thought about it. About the fear and uncertainty of those early days, about the constant performance and the danger and the complicated politics, about watching Luca push himself too hard, about confronting Valentina, about all the times she'd questioned whether loving him was worth the cost. Not for a second, she said finally. Because yes, it was scary and hard and nothing like what I imagined my life would be. But it was also real, Luca, more real than anything I'd known before. You saw me when I'd spent my whole life being invisible. You treated me like I mattered when everyone else treated me like background noise. And you let me see you, really see you, in a way I don't think you'd let anyone else see. So no, I don't regret it. Not any of it. Good, Luca said, pulling her close. Because I plan to keep you for at least another 50 years. Only 50? I'm being conservative. With modern medicine and your healthcare expertise, probably more like 60. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, both of them thinking about the unlikely path that had brought them here. A desperate nurse and a paralyzed mob boss, brought together by a contract that was supposed to last 6 months, and instead had become a lifetime. 10 years after that first wedding, the Moretti Foundation had expanded to serve 12 neighborhoods, employed over 200 people, and had successfully lobbied for healthcare legislation that would help millions. Luca had transformed the family business into something almost entirely legitimate, keeping just enough of the old connections to maintain respect in both the legitimate and underground worlds. They stood together at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the foundation's newest clinic, located in the neighborhood where Nora had grown up. Sophie, now 8 years old, helped cut the ribbon while photographers captured the moment. And Nora looked at Luca, standing beside her without assistance, his hand in hers, their daughter between them, and marveled at how far they'd come from that first meeting in Isabella's study. Thank you, she said quietly, knowing he'd understand. For what? For choosing me. Even when it was just a contract, even when you had 100 easier options, you chose me. And you kept choosing me. Always, Luca promised. From that first moment you argued with me in my own library, I was choosing you, Nora. I just didn't know it yet. The crowd applauded as the clinic officially opened, people from the neighborhood streaming in for free health screenings and services they couldn't have afforded anywhere else. And Nora watched them. People like her grandmother, like the version of herself that had existed before Luca, people who had been invisible and desperate and just trying to survive, and knew that whatever else happened, this mattered. They had taken something that started as a transaction and had built something real, something good, something that would outlast both of them. That night, back at the estate that had stopped feeling like a cage and started feeling like home, Nora found a letter on her nightstand. Luca's handwriting, careful and precise. Nora, 5 years ago, I stood at an altar in front of 300 people and made vows I wasn't sure I meant. I promised to love and cherish you, but I thought I was just reading lines from a script, playing a part to save my reputation and my position. I was wrong. Every word I said that day was true. I just didn't know it yet. You walked into my life when I was at my lowest, when I thought the wheelchair meant I was finished as a man, as a leader, as anything worth being. And you saw past all of that to the person underneath. You challenged me, fought with me, refused to let me wallow in self-pity or settle for being less than I could be. You transformed a business arrangement into a real marriage, a political alliance into a family, a criminal empire into something that actually helps people. You did all of that just by being who you are, honest, fierce, compassionate, and completely unwilling to accept the limitations other people try to place on you. I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. More than I did when we renewed our vows. More than I did yesterday, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for building this life with me. Forever yours, Luca. Nora held the letter, tears streaming down her face, and thought about the girl she'd been, desperate and invisible and willing to sell 6 months of her life for her grandmother's surgery. That girl would never have believed this was possible, that a contract could become love, that a transaction could transform into a life worth living. But it had. Against all odds, in spite of everything that should have made it impossible, it had. She found Luca in their bedroom, reading to Sophie before bed. He looked up as she entered, saw the letter in her hands and the tears on her face, and smiled. The real smile. The one he only showed her and their daughter. The one that made him look young and happy and completely at peace. I love you too, Nora said, kissing him while Sophie giggled. Forever. No expiration date, no contract clauses. Just us. Just us, Luca agreed, pulling both his girls close. The best deal I ever made. And it was. Of all the contracts and arrangements and strategic alliances that had defined his life, the desperate agreement with a nurse aide who needed money to save her grandmother had turned into the only thing that truly mattered. He'd found love in a transaction, hope in a wheelchair, and a future in the last place he'd thought to look. They had started with a contract designed to last 6 months. They had built a marriage that would last a lifetime. And every day they chose each other all over again, not because they had to, not because any contract demanded it, but because somewhere between obligation and choice, between performance and reality, they had found something worth keeping. Something real. Something true. Something completely and perfectly theirs.